and guests to today's meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee. The main items we'll be discussing today is the proposal to expand the Ultra Low Emission Zone to cover the whole of London and associated changes to the Mayor's transport strategy, in which the Transport Committee has an official role in feeding back. We'll have some short items of business first, though, so please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or on silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. And can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence, but Assembly Member Bailey is joining us remotely today, and Assembly Member Sheikh will be joining us shortly.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, Sean. Item 2 is the declarations of interest. So can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No. Thank you very much, members. And item 3 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the ongoing actions arising from the previous meeting of the committee and the additional correspondence received? Noted. Thank you. Right, so we move on to our first main item of business, which is asking about the expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone to our first panel of guests, who are all representatives of different transport and road users in London and residents as well. That will be the first part of our session for the first hour, and in the second part of the session, for around an hour and a half, we'll have representatives in from Transport for London to put questions arising from this and questions which members have in addition to that as well. So can I welcome our guests for our first panel this morning? We have Laura Vicinanza, thank you, who is the Policy and Stakeholder Engagement Manager for Inclusion London. Online we have Jemima Hartshorn, who is the founder of the Mums for Lungs campaigning group. And also online we have Steve Gooding, who is the director of the RAC Foundation. Welcome to you both. And also in the chamber with us we have Sarah King, who is the development manager for London for the Federation of Small Businesses. So I know you all have lots to say and ask about in relation to the proposed expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone. So I'll kick off with a couple of questions to you all, and I'll start with the members in the panel members in the room, and we'll go on to the people online afterwards. Just so briefly, to talk about the current Ultra Low Emission Zone, which extends currently to the North and South Circular. How successful do you think this has been in reducing polluting vehicles, cutting traffic levels and helping London achieve its emissions targets? And what's been the impact of this scheme on your organisation and its members? So to Sarah, first of all.
No, thank you very much. I think just in terms of the current scheme, obviously small businesses, our members and non-members, have been really trying hard to do the right thing, to upgrade their vehicles where they can, and those earlier on during the Mayor's scrappage scheme, they did take advantage of that. Even though some members and non-members missed out on the scheme because they weren't sort of in the right place to apply for it at the time, and also the scheme did slightly change, where I think originally a number of businesses could apply for more than one van at the time, and then as time went on the scheme slightly changed, which meant that some businesses missed out on that sort of further opportunity to upgrade vehicles, which did impact on them in terms of them upgrading their vehicles. In terms of sort of the environment, obviously we're hearing figures from Transport for London that there's a majority of vehicles entering the current zone that have become compliant, with more to become compliant yet. But I think the impact for small businesses is the cost of upgrading, the cost of changing their vehicles when they're trying to keep up with the policy changes. So whereas they were, before the ULEZ, they were compliant to a point, and then their vehicles needed to be upgraded, and just the cost, it's the cost all the time, and particularly now with the cost of living crisis, it remains a big issue for small businesses.
Pardon me. Thank you very much. And just a quick supplementary question from me to you specifically, Sarah. We've got some figures from the Mayor in February about the previous scrappage scheme, and that's broken down by type of vehicle. So just as a broad estimate, looking at vans will give us a clue as to the impacts on members of the Small Businesses Federation. £34 million, nearly £35 million was claimed for vans as part of that scheme. But one thing I noticed was that the number of applications was 18,500. Only 4,500 grants actually went through in the end. So was that people looking into the cost they would have to cover in addition to receiving the grant and deciding to put it off, or was that the grants running out that meant members didn't? Your members, the people with vans in London, didn't maybe take up as many of the grants as they first sort of tried to.
I think it's a mixture of things, actually. Some businesses still just weren't aware of the scheme, and so whereas the FSB ensures that its members are aware of the scheme, we're aware that from non-members in the London community, there is still a lack of awareness of what is available, what business support is available to small businesses to be able to do the right thing to enable them to become compliant with their vehicles. So I think in terms of the grant access, I think there was the point where at the beginning when it was launched, there wasn't total awareness. As the scheme became more promoted and businesses became more aware of it, they weren't in that position to apply for it. And when they did apply for it, some of the regulations had changed or the eligibility criteria changed, and they found it difficult to access. And then the scheme obviously closed and some missed out. And I think that was a really big issue for them. And many businesses would like to see going forward a very comprehensive scheme which doesn't have constraints, but if there are going to be changes to the scheme, that right from the very outset, any scrappage scheme promoted must be very clear that there might be changes after 6 months, after 1 year, as it gets reviewed with the take-up going forward.
Okay, we'll ask you some more questions about future scrappage schemes, but yeah, I just wanted to ask about the previous one. But thank you very much. Moving on to Laura from Inclusion London. Same question to you. How successful has it been, and what was the impact on your members and people you represent?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So we do represent deaf and disabled people organisation in London. And so I've spoken with people who have ULEZ compliant cars, people who have ULEZ compliant, who don't have ULEZ compliant cars but have benefit from the discount and exemption available, but also with those who actually, do not have ULEZ compliant cars and have, struggle to actually upgrade to compliant vehicles for reasons which I might sort of be able to come back later. But so I think one of the main impacts that the people I've spoken to have shared with me is that many had to sort of limit their day-to-day activities when it comes to sort of like attending medical appointments, for example, or visiting friends and family, and also I think so. It's more of the financial impact which our members have shared with us, and that's why we are concerned about the proposed expansion we listen to Outer London. So I think one of the main impact that we've seen, especially one of the concerns that have been shared with me is that some people have ended up staying at home because they couldn't afford to pay for the charge and they couldn't upgrade to the compliant vehicle. The people I've spoken to do need vehicle adaptations, and of course we're not saying that everybody needs vehicle adaptations if you have a mobility impairment, but the people I've spoken to needed vehicle adaptations, and they told me they find it really hard to upgrade, and they told me that the £2,000, which was the funding available through the scrappage scheme, was not sufficient as such. So that's probably a summary of the concerns.
And then a similar sort of question to you. There's no breakdown for adapted vehicles or anything like that, or blue badge holders in the information we've got on the previous scrappage scheme. But do you have an idea of how many people took advantage of it and how many people thought about it and then dropped out because it wasn't sufficient?
No, I can't just give you numbers. But so there are a series of issues. For example, that some people have shared with us with regard to sort of trying to apply for the car scrappage scheme, but they have not been successful because the car was in sort of the names of the nominated driver, who was the dead. But then this person couldn't actually wasn't eligible for the car scrapper scheme. And so I think all these sort of nuances have never been fully explored, even in the impact assessment which has been carried out by TfL. And I think, yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. So moving to the guest that we have online, Jemima from Mums for Lungs, would you like to go first with exactly the same question?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. So I'm the founder of an organisation called Mums for Lungs, which is all about children's health and the air pollution that we have in London and across the country. And we've been campaigning for 5 years, and we are sort of, glad that the ULEZ has come in to the sort of expanded part of London and is now being proposed for a wider rollout. So the ULEZ has been, in our opinion, very successful in reducing air pollution from nitrogen dioxide, which is one of the biggest pollutants in London and which is really strongly responsible for inflaming lungs, for making children and adults wheeze and get asthma. So that is really great that that has been achieved by getting the most polluting cars, or a majority of the most polluting cars have come off the road in the wider sort of London zone. And as a result, the nitrogen dioxide emissions have dropped, which obviously has a health impact in a positive way, which is great. I also think the good thing about the ULEZ has been probably combined with a few other factors, including increased awareness of the need for lung health and clean air as a result of the pandemic, is that people have become much more aware of air pollution from cars, especially diesel cars, since the last few years. So when we go out into the community and speak in stalls at markets and stuff, people are much more aware. It's much more topic. We hear from much more people who are really concerned. We hear from more people who've moved out of London because of air pollution. And anecdotally, although I think that is also shown evidence, more people have started cycling as a result of the ULEZ, even if their own car was actually compliant. I think it really has sort of set a bit of a it's been a bit of a change maker. These different factors that came together sort of around similar timings or within a shorter period of time have really encouraged people to take up cycling instead of driving, which is obviously great, because what many people are not aware is that air pollution is obviously caused and emitted by cars, but it is also really high inside cars. So, every kid that doesn't drive to school in London helps the environment and its own health in a number of ways. But what we also do see is that central London, the medium circle of London and outer London are still incredibly polluted, and that there is still a number of monitors, well over 10, that are monitoring illegal levels across London. And we can be sure that if there were more monitors, there would be many more hotspots of very high levels of pollution. And, since September last year, the WHO has strongly revised its air pollution targets of what it deems to be, recommended levels of air pollution, while at the same time acknowledging that there's no such thing as a safe level of air pollution. And for nitrogen dioxide, it put the levels down from what had previously been 40, which is the same as the legal or illegal levels in the UK, down to 10. So if we just look at nitrogen dioxide, air pollution across London is well above the levels that the WHO recommends. And that's the same for PM 2.5, which is another very strong pollutant, for which cars too are responsible, or contributing to, I should say, but which is not the primary pollutant. So yes, the ULEZ has been a success. Mums for Lungs is glad that we are seeing a consultation on an expansion to all of London. We would like to see more schemes. We would like to see a much further reduction of cars and especially diesel pollutants on the roads, due to the incredibly high human and health costs that still come with the air pollution we have in London, which is thousands of people dying prematurely, 10,000s of people being sick in hospital at very, very regular intervals, people not being able to work, people, not knowing why they're unwell, attributing it to a heart problem, which they would not have to that extent if it weren't for the absolutely toxic and high levels of air pollution we still have across London.
Okay, thank you. We'll ask more questions about the proposed expansion scheme later, but just focusing on the current scheme, when that was consulted upon, what was briefly Mums for Lungs' response? Did you ask for it to be London-wide at the time? Or
yes,
yeah.
We wanted it to be London-wide by 2021, and we thought when it was consulted on, which was January and February 2018, we thought that would also be enough leeway time to warn people across London that certain cars were not going to work anymore come 2021. And at the same time, while I don't want to at all talk down the effort it has to get a new car, in 2021, all the petrol cars, or still all the cars from 2004, 2005, petrol cars from that period are compliant. So, announcing that in 2018, in our view, would not have been too strict, but would have been a real clear signal that we need to put health first and ensure that every Londoner can grow up healthy and safely.
Thank you very much. So finally, from the first statements from our guests, Steve Gooding from the RAC Foundation, the same question to you. What has been the impact on your members of the current Ultra Low Emission Zone scheme and its expansion to the North and South Circular, and how successful do you think it has been?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give some evidence to you today. I should say we're the RAC Foundation, so we're a small independent think tank. We're not the RAC, so we don't have any members, but we do take a keen interest in schemes like this. We did some modelling work for and with the GLA and with Transport for London before the ULEZ was expanded. And I think the key thing I would have to say is that it is very early days, and to answer your question, the honest answer is we just don't know. We don't know yet. So the expansion happened only last October. There's a limited amount of data, very limited. I'm rather hoping your inquiry today will tease out some more from our friends at TfL in the second part of this hearing. So it's hard to tell exactly what has happened, and also because we live in slightly extraordinary times with the impact of COVID and what that's done, particularly to our commuting patterns. So how much of what we've seen has been a result of the introduction of the charge? How much has been a result of the fact that many of us are choosing to change our working patterns? And then thirdly, I'd like to pick up on something that Jemima was just saying, which is actually there's the impact of having to pay £12.50 a day potentially, but also there's the impact of the publicity, the very welcome, I would say, publicity that's been brought to bear on the issue and the rationale for doing this, which is, again, as Jemima said, has caused people at least to stop and think. If I don't want my family exposed to these pollutants, if I don't want my children to be exposed to them on the way to school, well, what could I do? And what could we do differently with our lifestyles? And I think that we've long supported, by the way, let's be clear, we've long supported the ultra low emission zone. There's absolutely no point being able to drive somewhere if you can't breathe in safely when you get there. And there's absolutely no reason why my family's health should be put at risk just for the convenience of other people driving around. So I think early doors yet, early days, we're really interested in seeing what the data shows once we've got some.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. And I'm going to take the next question to you first as well, Steve, if that's okay, because I think you're more likely to have done some work on this and have some sense of it. How far do you think the current ultra emission zone scheme is understood by Londoners and people driving into London? Are you finding that it's well known now, or is this struggling to become known at this current time?
I think it's always a challenge, frankly, because we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know who doesn't know it. So I would say that the expansion of the scheme out to the North and South Circular did get a lot of publicity. In a way, I would say it was quite surprising that there wasn't more negative coverage, which often happens, however well-intentioned an initiative is. And we haven't seen a massive pushback or massive coverage in the media, which some of us suspected might happen. And that in turn could mean that there are still people who are, shall we say, getting caught out or aren't fully aware of it, or as we were hearing from the Federation of Small Businesses earlier, they sort of know that there might be schemes that could help them, but they're not absolutely sure what the rules are or whether they would be able to benefit. So I think not bad, but if we look at such numbers as there have been so far about the number of fixed penalty notices issued, I don't think anybody sets out in the morning in a car or in a commercial vehicle hoping to pick up a fixed penalty notice. And the numbers do run into the, where are we, September 2021, we were looking at over 1 million having been issued. That's for the original smaller ultra low emission zone. So I suspect the fact is there are people who are still being caught out and there is still more to be done.
Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. And that question about how it's understood, can I just put that to Sarah and Laura? Maybe Laura first, you're nodding, you seem to have something to say already.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely people do understand what the ultra low emission zone means and what also means expanding it London-wide. So one of the things that, need to be said is that disabled people have struggle when it comes to using public transport. There are wider accessibility barriers when using, public transport. If we look at London Tube station, most of them are not actually fully accessible, and I'm not saying anything new here. There are also a series of barriers when using buses, which, by the way, are the most accessible form of public transport, but still there are some challenges around, overcrowding and wheelchair user having, struggling. So when it comes to sort of saying, maybe deaf and disabled people do not really understand, I myself have provided training to deaf and disabled people organization to make sure that they fully understood what TfL is actually proposing and also the mitigation measures which are actually proposed, which we will come back to that point after access to work, NHS reimbursement in the car scrapper scheme. I will say that there is a lot of lack of awareness around certain schemes, including the NHS reimbursement scheme, but also there are people who are aware and they don't really find it as effective as probably TfL thinks it is. So to answer your questions, yes, deaf and disabled people, understands what that means, and they understand that it's an important measure to reduce air pollution, and we welcome that as a measure to reduce air pollution, is an air quality initiative, but also we have to look at the cumulative impact of the policy and the financial impact that this is going to have. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sarah, any issues with understanding the current scheme?
Yes, thank you. I think just in terms of what the RAC Foundation was saying about the awareness and where it goes out to the outer ring road, that's great, and yes, we all understand that. But I think what's happened as well is that with businesses having to understand where the current zone goes through boroughs, they think, I'm going to Lewisham Borough, for example. They just think, Lewisham Borough, that's partially covered by the ULEZ, but they don't know exactly where that means. And so if they're looking to do a job and they have to cross that line, then suddenly they've got charges to incur. And I think then there's been issues to do with actually paying the penalty notices, whereas some businesses have tried to register accounts and they get frustrated that when you've set up an account, the account takes some hours for confirmation to come through, and then they almost forget they haven't paid. And so I think would be advantageous and good for the going forward is that any penalty notice structure, regular reminders are sent out through that sort of 3-day window, so that small businesses don't get penalised. They don't have to end up paying that high penalty cost because they haven't been able to set up that account. They've forgotten to pay on that one day because other things have taken over. So I think there are some frustrations with the current scheme in that sense. Also, we've had small businesses who are inside the zone and they've enjoyed for many years customers who've come to their, say, small garage, and those businesses have lost out to customers who have now decided they can't come into the zone and pay that £12.50 to get their car serviced. They've gone out elsewhere and moved out into Greater London instead.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting, especially the unclearness of the boundary, especially the South Circular particularly. When you've crossed the North Circular, but the South Circular is more of a normal road in many places. Right, I've got a question request from Assembly Member Bailey online in relation to these two questions.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's been answered because a lot of claims were made about the impact of the ULEZ, and I wanted to know where the evidence was, because we all supported the inner London ULEZ, but outer London is a very, very different place, many more cars, bigger distances to travel. So maybe to Steve and also to Jemima, what's the evidence of the impact that it will have on outer London? Will it be the same sort of reductions? And also the current ULEZ, you've talked about it as a success, but is it claiming success for other measures? So the government put in place the Euro 6 standards, etc., etc. Is it those changes that are driving down emissions, or is it the ULEZ? Do we have evidence for this?
Assemblymember Bailey, just to say we're asking questions about the current ULEZ currently.
Yes,
so your question about the impact of expansion will be covered later.
I accept that, but the current ULEZ, claims were made about its success. But I want to know, do we have the evidence that it's the ULEZ that's driven down? First, do we know emissions have been driven down? If so, have they been driven down by the ULEZ, or was it other measures such as Euro 6? People
I don't mean to overchair you, Assemblymember Bailey. Is that not a question later for TfL? Yeah.
Well, no. I asked now because a claim was made now. That's why I asked you.
I know, but we're not here to anyway. Can we put that to TfL later on? Is that okay with you? Thank you. I'll bring you back in then. Right, so moving on to the next set of questions about the proposed expansion, and Assemblymember Rogers will be leading on that.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a question about the consultation itself, which I'll put to each of our guests in turn. So I'll start with you, Sarah, as you're in the room. Could you tell me whether you think the consultation document itself is well designed to allow respondents to express their opposition or support? It has 28 questions. Is that too many? And do you think it's reasonable that there's no kind of yes or no question as to whether people actually support ULEZ expansion?
No, thank you very much. In terms of the TfL consultation, I think obviously it's out there, it's been well promoted, and I know we've been promoting it to our members, but also to our wider stakeholders to ensure that the message gets out. In terms of the questions, I mean, we are formally going to be responding as the FSB on behalf of small businesses. We've ourselves been out to consultation with small businesses, and our own survey has just closed, so we have got some really top-line raw data that we can share little bits with you today. But in terms of the survey, I think if there's lots of open questions, as long as it can be well analysed and everybody's point is taken on board, that's great. I think in terms of the survey that we had a good mixture of yes and no questions, but also open questions. So it gives businesses, but also residents, a real chance to give and share their view and opinion of what they think about the proposed ULEZ expansion.
Okay, and so your survey, did that contain a yes or no, do you support expansion or not?
Yes.
Kind of question.
Yes.
Okay. Do you have the number for that you could share, or am I straying into? Yeah.
We've got some very raw data. I can't remember it in terms of just yes and no questions, but we were more than happy to share sort of our findings from the survey, which will include sort of how many said yes, how many said no, after today's meeting, and we can share that with you afterwards.
I think we'd all be very interested to see that. But maybe then if I move on to Laura, the same question to you. Do you think that the consultation is well structured? Do you think there's too many questions? Do you think that there should have been a yes or no, do you agree?
Thank you for the question. I don't think necessarily too many questions. I think I will echo the comment that, open-ended questions are welcome, because, you can really gather, qualitatively what people think of the expansion. We have engaged with TfL in relation to the accessibility of the consultation as such, and they sort of made the consultation really accessible for people with different kinds of impairments. So I'm referring to the easy read consultation document, BSL videos explaining what TfL is proposing. There are also different ways to respond to the consultation. We really welcome that, and it didn't happen with other consultations, for example. So, for example, there is a possibility of completing the easy read survey. People can write to TfL via email, or can, write to TfL by post, or can even call TfL for. So I think our members have told us that they really appreciate the consultation being very accessible. But also I would say that in addition to the consultation, I think it's really important, what we really welcome is that the TfL have come to us to hear directly from members about what the challenges are, and they've taken on board, our concerns, which actually are reflected in the impact assessment which have been carried out. Thank you.
Excellent. And I'll put the same question to Steve from the RSE Foundation.
It's always terribly difficult to design these things. I know from my past life quite how tricky that can be. So I think what I would say, again, echoing some of the things you just heard, sitting around the specific consultation, obviously a lot of work is going into drawing in views and making sure they're drawn in not just through a simple questionnaire, but also through tapping up the various representative organisations who in turn can turn to their members and get a more subtle response. Do I think 28 questions is too many? For many of us, 28 questions does feel like quite a few. Do you want your family to breathe cleaner air? Yep. We don't think this is going to have a huge impact on you. Are you all right with it? Yeah, probably. That's probably the level of many of the conversations that many of us might have with people who aren't up to their eyes in the issues here. I don't think you could look at the material without getting a bit of a sense that the question isn't so much shall we do it as if we go ahead with this, what should we be doing to make sure we do it in the right way? And I think there's a lot here about, rightly, about getting the right balance between promoting the health benefits that the mayor is seeking to achieve and the mitigations that are needed for disabled people, for people on low incomes, for businesses that might be affected. You know, how do we cope best with the implementation and how might that run? So I think in the grand scheme of things, not at all bad. I've seen a lot worse. 28, probably not too many questions, but it's got to be viewed as part of a broader communications package and a broader hoovering up of views of what this impact would be.
Thank you. And if I put the question to Jemima as well.
Hello, thank you. So yeah, I think 28 questions is quite a lot, but I think the one thing that I found a bit frustrating, and I think I don't know if it might have an impact on the results as well, skew them in some way, is that you have to log in on the TfL website. And it's great that you can do the emails and things like that as well. But if you want to do the full shebang of questions, there's a login system. And I know that people might be reluctant to respond unless they feel very, very passionately about a certain topic, if they think they need to log in before and, you know, get another account and all these things.
Thank you. Actually, before I move on to my next question, a follow-up for Sarah, because you mentioned scrappage scheme earlier. The mayor's mentioned he wants a scrappage scheme. He says he wants the biggest scrappage scheme feasible, but there's no information about what that would look like, any figures or anything like that. Do you think it was reasonable to launch a consultation without any information about any potential scrappage scheme?
I just think from our point of view and representing small businesses, we were going to actually put within our response the call on the mayor to ensure that there's a very comprehensive scrappage scheme. So I think we were just going to include that in our response. But I think if businesses could feel assured that there is going to be a scrappage scheme, I think they'll look forward to doing the right thing and look to try and upgrade their vehicles to become compliant across the London region if it does end up going ahead.
Was there any? I mean, I appreciate you only just got the data yesterday, but was there much discussion around scrappage schemes and the responses that you received from your members?
Yes, definitely. In the open-ended questions, lots of calls for scrappage schemes, funding to help replace their vehicles. Huge number. So yes, that was very much mentioned. Also mentioned, though, was to delay the proposed expansion by 1 to 5 years. That very much came through too, because of the cost of living crisis, just really struggling, and the second-hand car market isn't. It's there, but it costs a lot to replace vehicles, and there's a supply. Obviously, new vehicles too. They're just really struggling. They're all the key messages coming through.
And your members, a lot of them will have obviously commercial vehicles, and my understanding is it's quite difficult to find ULEZ compliant commercial vehicles. Is that something that they've fed back to you as well?
Yep, comments like that too, absolutely. And very much the replies seem to be coming very much from the caring sector, from those that are tradespeople with tools and vans, and also veterinarians. They seem to be the really strong opinions and views from those at the moment.
When you provide us with the sort of data once you've had a chance to sort of analyse it, are you going to break it down by region of where these in London where these businesses are? I think
Yes, in terms of respondents, I must say it covers every single London borough. So in terms of figures, just briefly, we've got 77% replied from the London region. That's the Greater London region included.
It's a very high response rate then.
Yes, and the majority of those had 1 to 5 employees. 85%, I'd say more micro size, and 80% of them who responded all have business vehicles. So quite high figures. And 1 in 5 are on the periphery of London, so we did push it out to sort of Kent, Essex, Surrey, Bedfordshire. So we had respondents from those areas too, but the majority from the London region.
Yeah, fascinating figures there. If I'm slightly conscious of time, so if I could move on to my next question, and as we're talking, I'll stick with you. So, could you tell me broadly what you think the positive and negative aspects of the proposal to expand ULEZ London-wide are? And are there any other options or schemes that you would have liked to have seen or even preferred as opposed to this particular policy?
I think just hearing from what businesses are saying, if it's going to be expanded, the infrastructure is massively lacking. We've got one particular business who's a really strong case study. He has a fleet of vans. They're all ULEZ compliant. He said the big frustration is the infrastructure, but also then the delay when you're looking to recharge these vehicles when they're out and about with the tradespeople in them. It's causing frustration for the staff because of how long it takes to charge, and particularly if infrastructure points or infrastructure charging points are found to be already occupied, already broken, where these Zap Maps and other apps aren't absolutely up to date, showing the right data of whether those charging points are free and available and not broken. So the infrastructure, they really want to support it, and they do support it in terms of going green, doing the right thing, driving compliant vehicles. It is the infrastructure they're very, very worried about, and particularly if it goes Greater London region-wide, it's making sure that that is in place.
And that's mainly around some charging points for electric vehicles, is it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
Lara, if I could ask you the same question, positives and negatives of the proposal, and anything else you prefer or would like to see as well.
Yeah, so to summarise, I think we're not against the ultra low emission zone. We think that, there are a lot of nuances that haven't been fully explored and taken into account when it comes to expanding or to proposing to expand ULEZ London-wide. So I think we will be, what we would like to see is a policy which is not based on a one-size-fits-all approach, and it does take into account that there are some people who do rely on cars, that are the drivers and passengers, because there are wider accessibility barriers, as I was mentioning before. Especially in Outer London, the number of buses is lower. There are far fewer buses serving Outer London boroughs. The frequency of bus routes is even lower, and that means there is overcrowding and then passenger pushing and shoving each other. This is what our members told us, and wheelchair users specifically find it hard to actually find to find a priority space on the bus, because is being occupied by other customers with buggies or luggages or other wheelchair users. So it's quite difficult for them to get on the bus. And also we are in a cost of living crisis, which all of us know, and disabled people are poorer than non-disabled people. That's not just me saying this. This is if you look at statistics from Trust for London, 1 in 3 families with a disabled adult live in poverty, suffer from socioeconomic deprivation, and given the context in which we are living in, we can't just allow an expansion to cause disabled people to experience its financial hardship. That's what we are saying. Definitely there is a benefit, as we see it, from reducing air pollution. But of course, when we talk about health, because we were talking about health, I'm coming from a public health background, and actually when we look at the wider determinants of health, there's so many things that actually generate health inequalities, and that is, access to education, access to employment, income, wealth, and many other things. So I would say that if we, you might end up reducing air pollution, and so you can generate health benefits from that, but you might generate health inequalities when people cannot pay for the charge and need to stay at home. We've spoken to people who will be suffering from social isolation and social exclusion, and if you look at public health reasons, social isolation and social exclusion are very much drivers of health inequalities. So what we're trying to say is that a policy needs to take into account the wider determinants of health. It needs to be Outer London is different from central London, but also the cost of living crisis and the level of poverty in which disabled people live in cannot be absolutely underestimated.
Yes, and of course there are health impacts from financial hardship as well, which would need to be taken into account.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that one of the wider determinants of health is actually, income, access, to education, employment. If you look at statistics, disabled people tend to be more unemployed than, non-disabled people. And that's because, unfortunately, to discrimination in the labor market. And when actually it comes to being in employment, their salaries are lower than, non-disabled people. And they also tend to be underrepresented in senior roles. And also that causes sort of these structural inequalities. And so I think, it's really important that we take into account when we expand policies. And what we would have liked to see is actually an assessment and modelling of the health impact arising from social isolation and social exclusion, because actually this is recognised by TfL in the impact assessment. And what we only have seen, and I'm not disputing that whatsoever, are the health benefits resulting from air pollution. But we need to see also the impact resulting from the cumulative impact of this policy, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. If I could put the same question to Jemima, please.
Sorry, what exactly is the question?
Yes, I'll repeat it. So broadly, what do you think are the positive and also the negative aspects of the proposal to expand ULEZ London-wide? And are there any other options you'd like to have seen instead of or as well as?
Sorry, I didn't need to excuse myself for not remembering the question. I'm doing a bit of childcare on the side.
That's fine, absolutely fine.
So, look, the new proposal. So we called in 2018, Mums for Lungs called for a London-wide ULEZ to be expanded to all of London, well, sort of the current area, by 2021. So in line with the expansion to the North and South Circular. And I think the real positives should be that the boundary road, the North-South Circular, should really benefit from less pollution. And obviously it will set a sort of wider, clear sign to people to, upgrade the cars, and hopefully it will result in a significant drop in air pollution because the most polluting cars will come off the road. So that is all very welcome. But I do understand also that central London is still very, very polluted. And in terms of air pollution, probably more so than outer London. So I think we need to look at what would need to be done from a health perspective, from an air pollution aspect, to ensure that Londoners, wherever they grow up and grow old, it's not just the young who suffer really badly from air pollution, it's everyone who's exposed for their lives, and it's often the elderly as well, can really benefit from cleaner air. So at the same time, we would like to see a commitment to phasing out diesel. We know that diesel is the absolute biggest culprit of nitrogen dioxide pollution in cities such as London. So that is what we would like to see, a real strong incentive to discourage anyone from buying new diesels, at least, and making really clear that diesel vehicles, or diesel cars at least, let's talk about the private cars here, because this discussion is a bit more complex and complicated, are really unwelcome in London. And, the issue around the Euro Diesel 6 was raised earlier. The reality is that still a lot of the Euro Diesel 6, despite having been built after the diesel scandal, emit much more pollution than their legal limits are. They are actually not complying with what they should be complying with in many cases, not all of them. They are cleaner than they were, but they're not clean enough. And we think it would have been a really good opportunity at this point for the mayor to sort of clarify or make a really strong point to discourage Londoners, from buying a new diesel vehicle by sort of really setting an end date to diesels in London, and to begin a phase out, perhaps starting in central London and perhaps for 2030 or so, really clearly to get rid of diesel cars. So that is sort of one of the points we would have seen. There needs to be, I think while this ULEZ expansion is a welcome step, we need to see what else needs to be done to really get cleaner air. And we just need to be all clear, I think, that from a health perspective, from an air pollution perspective, this cannot be the last step for London for cleaning up the air. And, I think there were quite a few of options available that the mayor was looking at in February, I think, or early March, to introduce to London. And I am not sure if this is the measure that is going to be the absolutely most impactful on reducing air pollution, but we hope it will really have this impact.
Thank you very much. And finally, if I could put the same question to Steve.
In terms of the strengths and weaknesses of the proposal, I think that's your question. Yes. Clearly, in his forward and in the material around this, the mayor has been very conscious that he's trying to strike a balance here. And he's got to be very aware, as are we all at the moment, that we're facing something of a national crisis on the cost of living, on the impact of households, and being aware, as many of the witnesses this morning have said, that the vehicles that are likely to be racking up the miles and adding to the pollution problem are disproportionately likely to be those vehicles on which people in low-income households, for whatever reason they're low-income households, have come to depend on, or indeed affect the smaller businesses who are in turn hurting from a turn down in consumer demand. So there's definitely a conscious need to strike a balance there. Is this the be all and end all of it? I don't think so, and I don't think that the proposals suggest that. If anything, echoing something Jemima just said, I think that what the mayor is saying is, if I'm going to make another step and I'm going to make it quickly, this looks to me to be about the best one I can make without imposing a disproportionate cost on Londoners while still having a beneficial effect. But I would say, looking at the very comprehensive integrated impact assessment, so for those of us who made their way past the 28 questions and onto the about 280 pages, I think, all told, of other material, there's a lot of questions posed in there. And I think that the anticipated early year benefits of the scheme, let's just say they're not huge. And I question again the extent to which we're expecting the scheme, or the mayor is expecting the scheme of itself to deliver a tangible benefit in terms of vehicle emissions, or just in the act of promoting it, raising public awareness and saying, we've got to do things about the quality of air in London. We've got to do something to protect the health of our citizens. That is itself having a beneficial impact. So I guess it's a combination of the two.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That was all really interesting. Thank you. So, Assembly Member Garrett, take over a few further questions.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask, actually, firstly, a follow-up on the question that Assemblymember Rogers was just asking, just about alternatives, really. And one of the Mayor's earlier initiatives on clean air was about the what were they called, the low emission bus zones, which were specific areas that he designated where all the buses that would go through that area would have to meet what is now the ULEZ standard, although many were actually higher than that. I suppose as a specific alternative, I don't know whether any of you had anything to say about whether pursuing, let's say, cleaner buses with the money that's been set aside for this might be more beneficial overall than pursuing this. For example, I don't know, Mums for Lungs, whether you had a thought on, because I think it's 2034 before the mayor is going to get all of his buses clean. Obviously, buses spend a lot more miles driving than cars. I don't know if that's something you've looked at as specifically cleaning up buses as a targeted measure.
So great supporters of the low emission bus zones, and we can see in places like Putney or Brixton, they have really had an impact. So in those places where there is a huge amount of buses and where they are a huge proportion of the amount of traffic and pollution that is emitted, cleaning them up can be a real change maker to an extent. I do want to say though that one of the places such as Brixton Road, which was one of the first places to get a low emission bus zone, I think the second one in 2017 or so, is actually 2018, is actually still in one of the most polluted places in London. So that is just one example why cleaning up the buses is just not going to be good enough, I think, for all of London. Brixton Road, which used to be in the headlines along with Putney High Street within days of the new year for breaking all the legal levels, is still recording levels of air pollution that are at least 1.5 times or twice of the legal limits in London and the UK. So I think that is just one example why it's not good enough to only focus on buses.
Thank you, that's useful. I don't know whether anyone else wanted to comment on that question before I moved on. Oh, yes.
I think just
Sorry.
Sorry, Steve, why don't you go first? Sorry, this is the problem with these hybrid meetings, isn't it, Steve? If you,
apologies, yeah, I've tried the hat. I'm now going to have to work out how to lower the hand. There we go. I was just going to say that I think when we're looking at the packages of measures here, it's always tempting to go, well, this one will be better than that one, or this one will be better than that one. Where I think we do welcome the approach that TfL and the Mayor are taking is to say, well, hang on a sec, it's not cleaning up our buses would be better bang for buck than implementing the ULEZ or doing some other things. It's how do you bring these things together in combination? So I would say it's really quite impressive what Transport for London has managed to achieve on cleaning up its bus fleet. I think generally speaking, we would all welcome the idea that of all of the vehicles that are necessarily moving around and supporting the success of London, the success of whichever city we live in, we'd like the public service vehicles to be the cleanest. I think that goes for buses, as you said, because buses are going to be moving around quite a lot. I'm also thinking, for example, of some of our key workers, people who are visiting people who are confined to their homes for whatever reason, who very often are driving their own vehicles. And wouldn't it be a great ambition if all of London's key workers were also, at TfL's behest, driving around in the cleanest vehicles that they could have? So, I don't think it's an either or. It's we need to be doing these things. If they're within the gift of Transport for London, then more power to them if they make progress.
Thanks, Steve. Apologies for I didn't see your hand. That's entirely my fault. I do apologise. Sarah.
Yes, I'm just going to sort of echo sort of words that just raised by RAC Foundation there, but also in terms of public transport, to ensure it's affordable to all, to encourage those to leave their cars at home.
Sarah, sorry, can you put your microphone more at you?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. Maybe echoing RAC Foundation's words too, but to just ask that if we're trying to encourage the key workers, those small businesses with their staff to access public transport, to make it really attractive to use public transport, to make it cheaper to travel, so they don't always look to their cars, and also ensuring that the routes are there, that there are those buses on the routes that enable them to carry out their business and their staff too.
Is it just on that question? So as somebody who lives in outer London, it seems to me if you're, I think it's possibly a bit different for leisure journeys or journeys to work possibly, but if you're travelling as a work, let's say from one site to another, or if your job is a job that involves, say, a consultant or somebody who's travelling to different sites in the day, it seems to me that speed is probably a bigger factor than cost. So in other words, if the buses were very cheap but very slow, that would probably be worse from a business point of view than if they were just faster to get you where you're going.
Yes, speed important too.
Okay. I was just, sorry? Yes. Specifically, actually, I think we touched on the integrated impact assessment earlier. So I'll start with Sarah on this and go along, give everyone an opportunity. What, specifically in terms of the health benefits, can we expect or would you expect from the ULEZ expansion? If you, sorry, it may not be your area actually. Sorry, Laura. Yes. Sorry. Yes, Laura. Yeah. Sorry, that's my fault for being confusing.
So the benefits, the benefits, as I said, I think is sort of, the disabled people will be, breathing clean air, as has been said, because, disabled people are those proportionally impacted by air pollution, so there is definitely a benefit resulting from that. But as I said, I think, I was going to come to your previous question, actually. Oh. If we don't have, all London tube stations fully accessible to disabled people, if we, cut buses, as is being proposed currently, by 4%, and it could be 20%, how do we expect people to not rely on their cars? And also it must be recognized there are some people, for example, who I've spoken to are clinically vulnerable. They can't use public transport, for example. There are people who cannot switch to cycling or walking. I think it's a noble goal to reduce car dependency, but I think we need to accept in our society there are some people who are more vulnerable than others and need to be supported. So in a way, to answer your question, there are, benefits. We're not disputing that. But I think, as I said before, we need to look at, social isolation and social exclusion that are all sort of drivers of health inequalities at the end.
Okay, thank you. Steve, what would you expect would be the benefits of the health benefits from the expansion?
Well, again, it's quite hard, even if you look at the integrated impact assessment, the benefits specifically being attributed to the expansion aren't that huge in the grand scheme of things. I'm just looking, I think it's pages 6 to 10 of the integrated impact assessment as a range of benefits that are in the sort of the moderate to minor. A couple of them are negligible. So specifically on what is this scheme going to do by way of changing the trips people make and the vehicles that they make them in, or indeed the commercial trips. It's very important to remember that we're not just talking about cars here, even though they are important. But I think you have to stand back and ask the slightly wider question of, if this happens, then in the round, could this have a greater impact? But I suspect it's, of the options that the mayor had in front of him, it's not something that's going to have a dramatic change, and certainly it isn't quite the significance of some of the original ULEZ proposal. And partly that's because of the extent to which TfL is projecting compliant vehicles. So I think we should recognise. I think one of the Assembly members mentioned earlier, we have seen a cleaning of the fleet. I don't think it goes nearly as far as Jemima, or indeed her assistant, who I can see on screen now, would like. But progress has been made, and if we think, we're now in 2022, we're quite a way on from 2015, and even our diesel vehicles have got cleaner. So I think there's a limit to how much is going to be achieved simply by focusing in on those original Euro standards that TfL and indeed national government, in its encouragement to other cities, focused in on when it was originally coming up with the Ultra Low Emission Zone as a concept.
Thank you. And Jemima, what would you imagine are the health and pollution benefits that you would expect to see from the expansion?
So I think Steve has much more knowledgeable insight into this, but obviously we want to see less air pollution, and we need those schemes in across London that will really help clean up our air, because it is such a huge health cost, and it comes at such high cost, right? It's the one thing we can't do without for any more than a couple of minutes. We can, postpone eating for a while, we can postpone drinking for a while, but we're all breathing all the time, and it's the absolute essence of how we can manage as healthy and happy human beings. So really we need to see whatever can be done, and considering that cars, and particularly diesel cars, are such a driver of nitrogen dioxide pollution as one of the major pollutants in London, we need to get cars in those quantities off the road.
Thank you. Actually, if we go in the reverse order, I was going to then ask secondarily, which groups of people or types of transport do you think would be disproportionately affected? and what mitigations or exemptions you might want to see to help sort of smooth the passage of the policy. So if I start with you, Jemima.
I don't have a specific policy on exemptions, and I don't feel I'm the expert to speak on these kinds of issues. I think there was other speakers here much better and suited to that.
No, that's fair enough. Thank you. Steve.
Again, I'm going to point the Assembly to the integrated impact assessment, which has quite an exhaustive look, and I think is quite clear-sighted that there are groups. We've talked obviously today about people with about disabled people, but there are other groups, low-income households. They also pick out parents who are having to ferry children around as being another group in particular that need thinking about. And I think that in terms of specific mitigations, Transport for London has got a sense of the various things that could be done, not all of which are necessarily financial or about scrappage or replacing vehicles. I think you know, there's an issue about some ethnic minority neighbourhoods as well that TfL certainly needs to have in its mind. The other thing I should just say here, though, is of course, to an extent, because of the times we find ourselves in, things that the mayor might otherwise commit to doing, he's going to have to arrange a deal with the Transport Department because of the financial position that Transport for London finds itself in. So it's one thing to aspire to have an extensive scrappage scheme or extensive support schemes that promote other measures, and it's another one in the difficult world of 2022-23 to find the money to make those things happen. So we've got to be clear that there's a difference between the aspiration potentially and what's going to be deliverable when it comes down to it next year.
Thanks, Steve. Laura, what mitigations or exemptions you'd like to see to help those groups who are likely to be disproportionately affected?
Thank you. TfL's impact assessment states really clearly that the expansion of ULEZ will cause a disproportionate negative financial impact on those disabled people who actually travel by non-ULEZ compliant cars and do not qualify for what is called disabled tax class or disabled passenger vehicle tax exemption. So probably I don't have the time to go and explain, why, eligibility criteria are very strict. But I've spoken with people who do not qualify for a disabled tax class exemption, because in order to qualify for that exemption, you need to score 12 on the mobility component of PEEP, and that makes you qualify for the non-straight mobility component of PEEP. But many people who score, from 8 to 11 actually do not qualify for that rate. They qualify for the standard rate. So at the moment, there are exemptions given to temporary exemptions given to until 2027 as per the consultation to drivers of vehicles who have cars that qualify for this particular exemption. And we really welcome that. We've seen, the difference between those who've been exempted and those who haven't. So the issue, that I said is we are completely excluding a proportion of people who have mobility impairments and have, non-ULEZ compliant cars that cannot qualify for this exemption. And what we're being calling for is, an exemption of blue badge holders, because, blue badge is really a proxy of mobility impairment and includes also those people who do not receive necessary disability benefits. So blue badge basically helps someone who is disabled to park close to the destination. And also, we have to consider out of, 247,000 blue badge holders, some people have ULEZ compliant cars, some people have non-ULEZ compliant cars but qualify for the exemption. So we're talking about, just a certain proportion of people that we don't understand why actually they cannot be exempted from the ULEZ charge as it happens with the congestion charge. When it comes to other mitigation measures which have been proposed, access to work, we don't really think is an excellent mitigation measures, and I can, give you a flavor of what the issues are with access to work as we see it, because we've spoken with people. The NHS reimbursement scheme is a good measure, because, we've spoken with people who are not aware of the NHS reimbursement scheme, and they could have benefited from this scheme when it comes to attending hospital appointments. But, there are so many issues with the reimbursement scheme when it comes to sort of going to GP surgeries, for example, that is not covered by the NHS reimbursement scheme. People cannot pay up front for these charges and then ask the NHS to pay them back. These are things that we've heard from members. And then the car scrapper scheme, we will welcome an extensive car scrapper scheme. If you gave, the disabled people a new car, they will definitely, be more, they will be welcoming that. But as I said before, £2,000 is not fit for purpose in terms of enabling people to adapt to the expansion of ULEZ London-wide, and also if making that not relatable will be useful, because then it will avoid impacting people with means-tested benefits.
Thank you. That's quite a long list. It's clearly something you've thought about. Just as a pointer, you can possibly write to the committee if there are specific things that you want us to know about. And finally, Sarah, on that same question.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So in terms of some of the measures that we've been sort of considering and looking at the survey data that we've gathered so far from our own survey to respond to the Mayor of London's consultation, is obviously significant grants are very much needed for small businesses if we want to try and get them into the right vehicles to be compliant across the Greater London region. Just one small business, and I will just quickly read it out because it does sort of sum it up really well. I'm a very small business and won't be able to afford to upgrade to a compatible vehicle. I can only afford older vehicles and so will have to pay the charge. This will hit me hard, as already I have suffered for 2 years due to COVID restrictions, preventing me from working, combined with high cost of living and running a business now due to Brexit. I do not believe that this proposal is coming at the right time due to the difficult circumstances. Significant grants will be needed for small businesses to pay to upgrade our vehicle or exemption from charges. I have looked into the cost of getting a compatible vehicle and I would absolutely love to do so, but it just isn't feasible on my budget. Larger businesses and wealthier people will have no problem, but it will hit us lower down the scale hardest at an already difficult time, and I am an environmentalist, so this is a huge conflict of interest for me. However, I believe there are far better and more long-term solutions needed. This proposal won't stop smaller businesses from using their current vehicles. It will just cripple them financially as they pay the charges. Target large companies instead. Provide investment into eco-fuels. Plant more pocket forests, trees to buffer and absorb pollutants. Many other ways to tackle this issue in a fairer way. Basically, this business then goes on to say that the expanded ULEZ will force their business to close and make over 300 people redundant because 15% of their staff have cars that are ULEZ compliant, the other 85% aren't, and they just can't afford to replace their vehicles. So it's quite a strong sort of case study there to sort of give a good example. And the other thing that we've been discussing is the idea of where businesses are in non-compliant vehicles, they're having to pay the penalty charge. Could those penalty charge go into like an escrow type bank account that's held by a third party? So it's almost like a savings account for that business, that when it's in the place to then scrap the vehicle, apply for a grant, if that is what is available. And we really strongly urge a very good and comprehensive package of support is made available to small businesses, that sort of escrow account for those users, that money can then contribute to then making them afford a compliant vehicle.
Thank you. That's quite that's a poignant bit of case study there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. That was my final question.
Thank you. And apologies to the Labour group there, 'cause some questions you were planning to ask have already been covered by some of the answers there. I will pass over to you now and make it up to you later. Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you. It's always worth looking ahead to see what questions are coming up to make sure we don't cut across them, I feel. I just want to follow up on the questions about mitigations and exemptions, specifically about scrappage. I think that the underlying theme so far is that, we all want better air quality, but we all acknowledge that there are people through work, care or mobility reasons who will need to continue to drive. And because this obviously policy is based around getting polluting cars off the road, then, scrappage is a really, really core part of that. And we really agree that it needs to be a properly funded full scrappage scheme. I wonder if anyone in the panel has any views about which groups they would prioritise for support under a scrappage scheme. I'm going to start with Sarah. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, in terms of our membership, we are a small business organisation, and that's from 0 up to 249 employees. So that sort of range, ensuring that all those businesses in that group are well supported with a scrappage scheme. Obviously, once we've managed to have a chance to analyse our own data and see what the comments are across in terms of the open questions that have been asked and their answers, we can obviously provide that data back to you after this meeting.
I think that would be really, really useful. I am also checking, I think we are going to ask you further about the scrappage for disabled Londoners, if that's okay, Laura. So I'll leave that for the moment. Is that okay? Sorry. Steve, beg your pardon. Jemima, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry, I don't want to talk about specific groups. I just want to sort of highlight that, and without sounding naive, that there are sometimes also scrappage schemes in other countries that are done a bit more originally than I think what is quite common in London or the UK, which is a car for a different car. And I would just like to sort of raise the idea that it would be good to sort of consider offering people who are getting rid of a car at least the option of getting funds to invest in something else. And before anyone accuses me of being too simplistic here or a bit, illusionary, my grandmother is 89. She has 2 replaced hips. She can barely walk, but she is cycling on a trike everywhere. And she can't get up the garden at my mum's house, but she can cycle on the trike. And that is just one example where also, to be completely frank, with her current concentration span, we are all better off that she is cycling and not in a car, which at the same time, I'm pretty sure if she still wanted to drive in a car frequently, she would be allowed to. No one would have taken her driving license away or anything like that. But it would be significantly more dangerous for everyone involved than her on a trike. So, that is just something I do want to say, that there are schemes in other countries as well, where we have seen, I think in Italy, there was a scheme where a scrappage scheme was encouraged and people could, if they wanted to, invest the funds into an e-bike, for example. So I think that should be something to be considered. Or I think somewhere else there was a scrappage scheme where people could get really substantial amount of money on a car that they could use for public transport instead if they wanted so. But again, that obviously then does go into the wider context of the connectivity, the public transport, the availability of buses in outer London, and then that would be linked back to the need for a good TfL deal.
That's really helpful. Thank you. That's a good addition to our considerations. And Steve, do you have anything to add about how to target scrappage for any new extension?
I think it's really a slippery slope to try to prioritise one group against another, particularly when we're talking about private cars and discretionary travel. Is my discretionary trip more valuable than your discretionary trip, or is it more necessary to accommodate it? What I would say, though, is that I take you back to a comment I made earlier, that if the trips that people are making are as part of delivering public services, and I'm thinking here particularly about social work, people who are visiting households to look after people who are ill or disabled or elderly or some combination of that, then I think we should be thinking if the trips they're making are being made because they're part of a public service, then we should be doing everything we can to enable those people to make them by the cleanest means possible. And that's potentially in some cases not by a car or a motor vehicle at all, but for many of them that's going to be necessary in order to complete the number of visits they've got to make in a day. And if that's the case, could we do something to make sure that they have the opportunity to do that in a vehicle that has the least environmental impact on the rest of us?
Thanks. Those are really helpful contributions. Thank you.
So, Assemblymember Sheikh, would you like to follow up with any more details on the request from Inclusion London earlier on? I know you've already also sent us already, Laura, a written submission that we already have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, Laura, it's good to see you, and it's great to hear from the whole panel, but my question to be directed specifically at you, so we can draw out a little bit more about disabled Londoners' experience and thoughts when it comes to the expansion and the current ULEZ. And I know that we've met and we've talked about this, so in danger of asking you to repeat what we've already discussed, I think it would be good just to maybe use this as a sort of, as we end the panel, this section of the panel, final summary of the key points. So I will ask you some slightly repetitive questions, but feel free to refer to previous answers. So just to start off by, and I know you've already drawn on this, the kind of difficulty for disabled people to access the exemptions set out within TfL's existing and proposed schemes. If you could just reiterate and highlight the key points on that, that'd be great.
Are we talking about specifically the disabled tax class exemption?
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes, and yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'll explain a little bit how sort of assessment for disability benefits work.
That'd be grand.
And actually, so the two kind of forms of disability benefits at the moment are personal independence payments, PIPs, and DLA, disability living allowance. Although most people who were in DLA, are actually being sort of moving to PIP anyway. When you're assessed for disability benefits for PIP, for example, you can get, there are two components, the daily living component and the mobility component. So the daily living component is very much about help that people need with everyday tasks. So you can be washing, dressing, eating, this kind of stuff. And then you've got a second component, which is the mobility component, which is what, it's relevant here really. And it's very much about, working out the routes and following it. So there is an assessor who has a series of descriptors, which are very health descriptors, that sort of assesses whether you can physically move around, whether you can leave your house. And based on that assessment, someone gets a score, and the score is up to 12. And so if you get a score between 8 and 11, you qualify for what is called the standard rate of the mobility component of PIP. Instead, if you qualify for the maximum score, if you get, the maximum score, which is 12, then you qualify for the the enhanced rate to the mobility component of PIP. And so, coming back to sort of the ULEZ expansion and the current discount and exemption, so currently, only those people who qualify for the enhanced rate, the mobility component on PIP, can actually register their vehicle with the DVLA, which is the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, as having a disabled tax class or disabled passenger vehicle tax class. Because, of course, there are, I've spoken to people who use the car as drivers. So, for example, their wheelchair accessible vehicle they use it as a driver, but also those who use it as a passenger. And so the issue that we have identified, that we've spoken to TfL about, is that this current exemption, to be fair, excludes many people, and there must be a way for them to calculate how many people will be impacted who have mobility impairments. And because unfortunately in the impact assessment, TfL does recognize there is a disproportionate negative financial impact on these people, but then there are no data regarding the number of people that will be impacted. And I think what we would have liked to see is an assessment, a calculation of how many people have, for example, who have a blue badge. If they don't like the blue badge, they can use another, component. But I think the blue badge is useful because he is a proxy of mobility impairment. He also includes people who are not on disability benefits. So they should really calculate the number of people with mobility impairments who have ULEZ compliant cars, those who don't have ULEZ compliant cars but are actually qualifying for the exemption, and those who don't have either ULEZ compliant cars who do not qualify for this exemption.
Thank you. Yeah, I think clear from you is we need better data on the number of people impacted. If it's, if Blue Badge as a mechanism of identifying people who should be exempted isn't something that TfL like, perhaps it's our job on this side of the table as well as yours to convince them otherwise. So just sort of maybe expanding on that particular point again, why do you think using Blue Badge scheme to identify exempted people is better than the current proposals of applying exemptions to registered vehicles?
because the blue badge, as I said, is a proxy of mobility impairments. It also includes people who do not have necessary disability benefits. So you're given a blue badge because you have a walking difficulty or mobility impairment. And of course, if you have a disability benefit, you automatically qualify for it. But then if you don't have disability benefits, you need to do an assessment, you need to send information, and then you get, the blue badge. That's how it works. I think I'm not really satisfied with, the sort of the impact assessment which has been carried out when it comes to blue badges. So the argument which I've been hearing is blue badge holders can be exempted from the congestion charge because they need to be, they need to be dependent on using a private vehicle and they cannot avoid the congestion charge. But then when it comes to the ultra low emission zone, what TfL has said is that if blue badge holders were exempted, it would remove the incentive for vehicles that may transport blue badge holders to switch to cleaner vehicles, will undermine the benefits of the scheme. But what sort of incentive are we talking about? Disabled people live in poverty. I don't understand what you want to incentivize them to do. And also, if you don't calculate, as I said, the number of people who will be impacted, how can you be sure of the level of air pollution that will be generated from giving it the exemption? These probably should have been included in the impact assessment, and based on that we could have an honest discussion around the level of air pollution resulting from giving the exemption to blue badge holders.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was really loud and clear, and I think I certainly agree with your comments. Okay, moving on to some other questions I have for you. Again, feel free to draw on other answers you've given already. Have you and other disability campaigners had adequate opportunity to share your views and concerns in relation to this consultation?
Yes, so we have engaged with TfL, particularly with Cristina Calderato, a number of times before the launch of the consultation. So we joined a workshop that was organized by Jacobs, which is the independent agency that conducted the impact assessment, and Transport for London in around March, if I'm right. And there we shared the views and the concerns our members sort of share with us. But then even following the launch of the consultation, we have there is a GLA DDPO forum, a Deaf and Disabled People Organization forum, and in that sort of context, some member of the Ules consultation team attended and explained what the consultation was going to be about, and also asked us for how they could make the consultation accessible and inclusive for people with different kind of impairments. We've also engaged, I guess the latest engagement we had with TfL, with Cristina Calderato specifically, was when we had a workshop with deaf and disabled members who are representative of various DDPOs, both in central London and outer London, and Cristina Calderato herself attended the meeting to hear directly from members and also respond to questions. So I guess, I think, TfL have engaged with us quite a lot. I can't complain about that.
Good, I'm really pleased to hear that. Final couple of questions for you, Laura. Could a scrappage scheme help disabled Londoners who need to drive continue to do so whilst removing polluting vehicles from the road?
I think it depends on what the car scrapper scheme, the sort of proposal of car scrapper scheme. Because the car scrapper scheme wasn't included in the consultation, which is quite problematic because people, they should have been given a full picture, I think. But it depends on the kind of scrapper scheme which is proposed. It definitely, if I look, TfL's financial situation at the moment, I honestly,
that's not good for your mental health.
Yeah, exactly. So I just can't see, how extensive the scrapper scheme will be. Because as I said, if you look at some, for example, wheelchair accessible vehicles, and the average cost of a drive from a wheelchair accessible vehicle is about £30,000. So I think, as a measure, and also, and I've said to many of you in this chamber, if you increase funding available through the car scrapper scheme, but you still consider that a savings, people who are on missed benefits, and we have a lot of members who do not, who, for example, rely on universal credit in addition to personal independence payments, these missed benefits will be impacted, as a result of the funding provided through the cash scrapper scheme. So I think one of the things I would like to say is that, re-engage with the Department for Work and Pensions, ask them to make these grant payments as income rather than savings would be a good step forward. But this has been considered non-feasible in the impact assessment, so I guess.
Yeah, no, these are really smart and nuanced suggestions. Really grateful to you for them, and I think absolutely any scrapper scheme. I mean, I think it's really helpful that you've basically kind of taken a step back and said it needs to be in the context of national governance, because you need to have a linked up governance when it comes to this, so that it doesn't affect means-tested benefits, that you do have the DWP on board. And that's why, for instance, given the financial context of TfL, I do think that we should be seeing funding from national government for a scrapper scheme that can benefit all Londoners, but in particular protect disabled Londoners who shouldn't be, negatively impacted by being able to access a scrapper scheme. So thank you so much for drawing out those points so eloquently. I think that's me done, Chair.
Thank you very much. I just want to extend huge thanks to all the people who've joined us for that initial panel. We've gone over the time we allowed. We need to allow time to put the things you've raised to TfL. So I'm going to say thank you and goodbye to you now. We are going to take a short break for 5 minutes only to switch over. And we'll come back with our guests from TfL and we'll ask them questions for the next period of the meeting. So thank you, and a short adjournment now. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back to the London Assembly Transport Committee. We're looking at the proposed expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone to the whole of London and the changes that are associated with that to the Mayor's transport strategy. So I want to welcome our guests for the second panel. We have, left to right, we have Christine Calderato, who is the Director of Transport Strategy and Policy at Transport for London. In the middle, we have Alex Williams, the Director of City Planning for Transport for London. And on the right there, we have Elliot Traherne, who is the Head of Air Quality for the GLA. So not TfL, but from, I guess we're from TfL. You're actually from the GLA. You're the people running this consultation, and he'll be implementing the policy. So we have quite a few questions for you. So what I'm going to do is pass the questions around to the different members who are leading on each one, and then any of you who want to ask supplementary questions, just indicate, and I'll maintain a list, and we'll go through that at the end of this section. So first of all, Assemblymember Baker, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good to see you all. Firstly, I want to ask about the timing of the announcement to expand so soon after the last expansion. We've had concerns raised in our earlier panel about the time, whether we've had enough time to evaluate all the impacts of the last expansion before moving on to suggest another. Why are we attempting to do that so soon? Can you give us an outline on that?
Good morning, everyone. So maybe I'll start with that, and we'll probably divvy up the questions amongst us as we go. I think the key thing is we've obviously seen a huge amount of progress over the last few years in tackling air pollution. And as we've been going, obviously, we've been implementing measures and we've been evaluating those. So we have a good understanding about what's good and what's effective. In particular, the work that we did to understand the impacts of the Central London ULEZ was really important in demonstrating what a transformative policy this was. And we were very keen in making sure that as we continued to set out the action we needed to take to improve air quality, to protect public health, to tackle the climate emergency, and to respond successfully to the pandemic, that we actually responded to that evidence and that we took into account the new information that we were getting, particularly from the World Health Organization, who had set out new evidence and their new recommended guidelines in terms of levels of air pollution that people should be exposed to, which demonstrated that even very low levels of air pollution could have very significant effects on health. And as a result of that, as a result of the need to continue to tackle the climate emergency, the Mayor was committed to taking further action. And what we were able to do is, of course, look at that evidence that we have from the ULEZ, and that was able to inform the next set of action that we actually wanted to take. And I think in terms of our understanding of air pollution, the other thing that we've had over the last few years is as we've been looking at those trends of improvement that we've seen in air quality across the city, they have not been equal. We have seen very fast improvement in central London and also in inner London, but the pace of improvement in outer London has been slower. And we also know from the work that we've done and the evidence that we've collected that some of those impacts in outer London, where a greater proportion of the attributable deaths to air pollution are located, it became very apparent that it was important to take further action. And that's why the Mayor has asked TfL to consult on expanding the ULEZ London-wide.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything? No, that's fine. I thought you were indicating. Do you think that actually we should have just bit the bullet and expanded it to the whole of Greater London at the time?
I think there are plenty of people in the consultation that we did at the time, 2 and a bit years ago, that had that view. And it was quite interesting, I think, looking back at that consultation. I think the two issues that were most difficult to get a consensus on, one was about timing of delivery. Some people thought it should be earlier than October 2021. Some people thought it should be later. And the other issue was boundary. Some people thought it should be North and South Circular. Some people thought it should be borough boundaries. Some people thought it should be all of London, actually. And I know certainly in conversations with London councils, they really struggled with that issue, really. And we went for the inner London boundary, which is a very logical boundary on the north. It's less coherent on the south. I think people know where the South Circular is, but it is quite circuitous. But I think we went for that mainly because that's where the air quality problems were most acute. and I think it was right to focus our efforts there. But that's not to say that there isn't a problem with poor air quality in outer London, which there clearly is. The majority of the 4,000 premature deaths per annum in the capital are in outer London. So I think it was a logical stepping stone from central to go to inner. But as I say, going back to the consultation we did 3 years ago now, it was a difficult issue, and it was one of the issues that the Mayor considered when he considered the consultation report that we put in front of him.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm going to try and express this question clearly. If it doesn't entirely make sense, please do clarify. So what are your expectations for how the 2023 ULEZ expansion will contribute to reduction in traffic levels, air pollution and carbon emissions? And I'd just like to say, obviously, primarily this is about air quality, but we've seen some people's expectations, and some of the messaging also looks at traffic levels and carbon emissions. So can you let us know what the expected outcomes, what you're expecting on all those issues, and obviously which ones are most important?
Yep, all that data is in the publicly available reports that are out there. So in terms of traffic, we're not visiting a huge change there in terms of overall volumes, but 70,000 fewer vehicles a day. For nitrogen dioxide, we're assuming 9 to 10% reduction in nitrogen dioxide. For PM 2.5 in outer London, we're expecting a 16% reduction. And for CO2, in percentage terms, it's not huge, but it's around 27,000 tonnes. So that's the evaluation we've done for the London-wide ULEZ scheme. So it's quite significant. And if you look at I think there was some commentary in the previous session say those figures are not that huge. I certainly on NOx, I'd dispute that in PM10. These are big impacts over a large area. I think if you also look at the Central London scheme in 2019, much bigger impacts in terms of NOx. I think 44% reduction in NOx there, but a very small area. So I just think we need to think about kind of scale when we look at these numbers, really. They are significant steps in the right direction of improving air quality and decarbonising transport.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. I would like to ask supplementary on journeys, specifically journeys now. Okay, right. Thank you. So specifically, I'd like. Okay, sorry. Sorry, confusion on this side. I'm a bit concerned about the 70k loss of journeys and what loss of journeys we will have had previously, because this is sort of, as I see it, a knock-on effect and not the primary aim of the ULEZ. So therefore, can we tell which journeys are being lost? Are those journeys that are having a significant impact on people? Are they people who simply cannot afford to upgrade their vehicle? So have you got any sense of what journeys we're losing, and is there a disproportionate impact?
We haven't got a breakdown in terms of journey purpose for that, really. But one of the experiences from the Inner London scheme is that what we saw is that people who had non-compliant vehicles, who were the older, dirtier vehicles, they used them quite a lot less. And I think that's understandable, really. If you're going to incur a £12.50 charge every time you use it, you would use your vehicle less. So that's what we're assuming will happen for a London-wide ULEZ scheme. In terms of the makeup of those trips, what they're doing for that, we haven't got that analysis. But I think we'd probably consider that as part of the integrated impact assessment, but it's not quantified in terms of a breakdown of that number.
I mean, I'll finish on this. Does this concern you?
Less traffic on the roads?
No,
it doesn't concern
the type of the fact that the type of traffic isn't quantifiable, so we could be having unintended impacts on people.
So I think that's
less
the reason
able
for
to
doing the integrated impact assessment, to just try and look at it by segmentation. But in terms of quantifying it to that level of detail, I just don't think that's possible, to be perfectly honest.
Okay.
But I think you do an evaluation through the IIA, and I think we've already heard from the previous session that's quite a comprehensive analysis of the potential impacts.
Okay, thank you.
Alex and all our guests, can I just make sure that you put your camera at yourself when you're speaking, your microphone at yourself when you're speaking? Thank you. It is quite directional, so if it's pointing slightly to one side, you're quite quiet to us here, and we've got noise behind us. Thank you. So handing over to Assembly Member Garrett now.
Morning. consultation documents don't provide any estimate of the cost of doing the scheme, I should say specifically expanding the scheme from the inner zone that we have now to the proposed London-wide zone. TfL briefings have indicated that it's something around £200 million. Do you have a clarity on that figure at this point? And related to that, are we sure the scheme is good value for money, both in terms of the policy objectives it's trying to achieve and in terms of the alternatives?
The estimate of costs is still being worked through. The latest working estimate is 185 million to install it, which is all of the back office infrastructure, the on-street cameras, and all of the signage changes. And the signage changes are mainly to change the ULEZ signs on the boundary to ULEZ and ULEZ. So it's not a huge amount of work. It is in terms of cameras, but in terms of signage, they're very similar signs to ones that exist now. So that's our working assumption at the moment. However, it is the working assumption. There's still a lot of detail to go through that on that. I'll give you an example of that is we need to go through every road on the borough boundary and work out where the cameras will be, whether it can be on existing infrastructure, on traffic signals, or whether it needs news posts, does it need 2 cameras. So that work is underway at the moment. And we'll have a more detailed figure for when the Mayor makes a decision on this towards the end of the calendar year. But at the moment, the estimate is 185 to install it in terms of capital costs. In terms of good value for money, we're also doing work on the BCR, the benefit cost ratio, and again, that we'll kind of confirm that when we're clear about what our detailed estimate of the cost is. But I think a key driver for that is number and location and ease of implementation of the cameras.
Okay, is the scheme expected to make a financial surplus?
Yes, one of the things you'll be familiar with previous schemes. One of the things we've struggled with is the accuracy of the income for these schemes, because they're not about generating a profit. They're about improving compliance with air quality. So we are estimating the annual surplus. First full year would be circa 200 million, but we're giving ourselves quite a big variation on that. But it could be plus or minus 50% of that, really. And I think one of the challenges we have is that these schemes do lead to some pretty rapid changes of compliance. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the Inner London scheme, the compliance rate increased by 7.5% in 2 months. Just 2 months, it shot up.
Sorry, when you say 7.5%, do you mean 7.5 percentage points or 7.5%?
Yeah. So it went up from, I think it was something like the mid-70s to the low 80s in 2 months. So I think my finance colleagues are constantly telling me I need to be more accurate in terms of these figures, really. But it is actually very, very difficult. So that's what we've landed on. We assume it's a circa 200 million surplus in the first year, and that will diminish over time as compliance improves. But we're giving ourselves quite a lot of range there, the plus or minus 50%, because in some ways I think the kind of cost of living crisis we're living adds weight to that level of uncertainty that we're in at the moment.
Okay, and did TfL consider other measures aimed at reducing air pollution before deciding on the ULEZ expansion plan? And what were they, and why did you go for that option?
Yeah. So when we were asked to look at a number of measures that could help further reduce emissions in London, and there were a number that we kind of looked at in detail. One was a Greater London boundary charge. Another was a low-level clean air charge, so that would have had a tighter standard, so it would have effectively been a much lower-level charge applied across a much larger population. We looked at expanding the ULEZ to cover the London-wide area, and we looked at doing that in conjunction with a clean air charge, so effectively a kind of low-level charge and a higher-level charge for those more polluting vehicles. And what we saw when we looked at that actually, and thinking about making sure that we struck the right balance, was that expanding the ULEZ gives you these really strong emissions reductions, which Alex has already outlined, but whilst impacting the smallest number of people in terms of increasing number of the cost, because you are just looking at that kind of smallest percentage of the most highly polluting vehicles. And so having examined the impacts of all of them, that was the one that seemed to strike the best balance of policy benefits for Londoners whilst not increasing costs for more people than we needed to do that for. At the same time, we were also looking at whether a kind of more sophisticated integrated road pricing scheme could be effective, and I think we think that that really could be. That's a longer term scheme that's going to take longer to develop. It's more complex to implement, so we're going to start work on that now. But in the shorter term, this was a scheme that gave you really good benefits while impacting the fewest number of people.
Okay, did you look at, obviously, so the Mayor has a plan, buses, diesel buses, obviously a big source of pollution, and the Mayor has a plan to replace buses with low emission buses by, is it 2034? Did you look at accelerating that as an alternative to this?
Yeah, so as you said, the bus fleet, we've already invested in making sure that the whole bus fleet is ULEZ compliant, and we've got more than 800 fully zero emission buses now. We think that will be, we can have a fully zero emission fleet by 2034. A lot of this depends on government funding, and if there was more government funding, it might be possible to look at accelerating that. But I think from where we are now, this is something that we know that we could implement and would guarantee those emission savings for Londoners.
So that you didn't look at that as an alternative to this? That's just a parallel piece of work on a separate track?
Yeah, and I think a different scale of emissions reductions.
Okay. On a different note, in 2018, the Mayor told the Assembly that cost-benefit analysis for this kind of expansion suggested that more targeted measures would be better used. So what do you think has changed from then to now that he's now pursuing that?
Would you want to go?
I think it's probably worth going back to what I said in my opening remarks, really. The World Health Organization, which obviously has the best repository of expertise in terms of understanding about the health impacts of air pollution, last year did provide additional guidance where they significantly tightened their recommended guidelines, not just as we were expecting for PM2.5, but also for nitrogen dioxide. And that really underlined the huge negative impacts on health that even exposure to relatively low levels of air pollution can have. And I think that provided really important context for why the Mayor wanted to go further. I think also on the climate change side as well, you'll be aware of the Element Energy report that we've done, which has also demonstrated that we need to start thinking about how we can deliver further reductions in emissions from vehicles. So, the context that we were operating in was changing. The analysis that we'd done, the understanding that we had, particularly in outer London, of the rate of change compared to central and inner London. And when you take into account the health impacts that we already had a good understanding of, the greater proportion of those being in outer London, it really underlined the need for further action. And that, as I said, is why the Mayor asked TfL to look at those range of options and then to take forward the expansion of the ULEZ London-wide to consult as a proposal.
Thanks. So, Alex, you mentioned a moment ago what your estimate was and the uncertainty around the estimate of the revenue from the first year of the proposed expansion. I just wondered, do you have a figure for the revenue raised by the North and South Circular expansion to date, and how that compares with the estimate?
I think the net operating surplus is circa 110 million for the, but I think that's the combined. It's the inner London scheme, so it's central and inner. Yeah.
Presumably,
that's
bulk
for
of that, though, is the expansion.
21-22.
Sorry. Presumably, the bulk of that though would be the expansion, just because the inner London bit is quite small.
Yeah, but it's also not. It's only part of the financial year, so I haven't got an estimate for the full financial year yet. But it's because this is 21-22 and it came in towards the end of 21, so it's got 6 months of that.
Okay. Let me have a look. I think the other question I was going to ask about the cost, I think you have covered. So I was just going to finally ask about the proposal that you have for increasing the penalty for non-compliance from £160 to £180. I was just wondering what the thinking was behind that, what led you to that new figure?
Yeah, so the last time the penalty charge notice for the congestion charge, which also applies to the ULEZ, was increased was in 2018. And it is something that we do have to kind of put up periodically to make sure that it maintains that, it's still an effective deterrent and disincentive. So I think just in the context of inflation, that since then public transport fares had increased, that the congestion charge level had increased, the relative pricing of it meant that that kind of deterrent effect becomes diluted over time. And we kind of see the impact of that because we see that the number of people receiving multiple PCNs, the percentage goes up as well. So we need to increase them periodically to make sure that they kind of maintain that deterrent effect. And that's why we're proposing that it goes from £160 to £180. What I would say, though, at the same time is that it's really important to consider that in the context of removing that £10 auto-pay registration fee as well. Currently, if you pay by an account, you pay £10 per vehicle per year for that account, but that means that your charges are automatically deducted and you will never get a PCN. But we recognise that £10 is kind of a cost barrier, and if we're proposing to expand the scheme and bring in more people potentially who haven't paid before, we want to make sure that there's no barrier to people being on an account, which should mean that there's no reason for anybody who can sign up to account to incur a PCN. So we don't want people to get them, but we need to make sure that they're set at a level where they remain kind of at the right deterrent effect.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I just check? I was listening, but did we manage to get a benefit cost ratio as part of that questioning? Or
I said it was being worked on.
It's being worked.
Yeah.
Will you give us that when you have it?
Yeah, I think it clearly you need to know an accurate estimate of your costs, and that's being worked through. So we think it's circa 185, but that work's underway to get a more detailed estimate.
Do you have a circa figure for the benefit cost ratio?
Not at the moment, no. Okay. But we will have a figure and probably a range in the decision paper that goes to the Mayor. But we will, when it's available, we can share it with you. Certainly.
Okay, thank you very much. So handing over for questions now to Assembly Member Pigeon, the Deputy Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up questions on the scrappage scheme. So I don't know who would like to answer those. But in some ways, you've got a consultation going ahead without understanding, the full context here, what sort of scrappage scheme will be there. And I've asked the Mayor about this previously. Should the consultation be going ahead with that vital bit of information missing?
It's a very good question. I think the way that we've approached it is that we didn't want to preempt what the consultation was going to tell us. So it's really important during the consultation and during our stakeholder engagement, and you've heard that from previous guests, that we want to understand from people how they think these proposals will impact them, who will be affected. We understand that the outer London context is different. And so through that engagement, through the consultation, we want to understand how we can best develop a scrappage scheme, which might not need to look exactly the same as the previous one looked, because we are in a different context and those impacts might be different. And so we wanted to learn through consultation to inform what that scheme should look like, whether the eligibility needs to be different or expanded or changed in some way, whether the payment levels are still right, how the cost and availability of vehicles might have changed. So the purpose was really to allow people to tell us so that we could create the most effective scrappage scheme rather than trying to withhold the information. So we've been clear that we want to offer the support. People know what was in place last time, but we really want to seek people's feedback on what they need from that scrappage scheme so that we can make sure that we target the funds in the most effective and supportive way.
In some ways, people may respond differently to this on the basis that actually, they might be happy if it's they get a completely new vehicle virtually paid for compared to £1,000 towards one.
And I guess hopefully that's what we pick up through the survey. So asking questions both about the proposals, the impacts, the scrappage scheme. Is it important that we have one? There are the free text boxes. Yeah. So if somebody's, say, I'm supportive of the aims, but this would be difficult. However, if there was a scrappage scheme in place, then there is space for them to give us that feedback. And that's what we're looking for through the survey. I know there's been reference made to the number of questions. There were quite a lot of questions in there, but hopefully that means that we get that richness of information.
Okay, thank you. Now, we talked earlier that the cost estimate for the expansion is 200 million, though I think, Alex, you've said now it's about 185 million. Just for the record, to be clear, that does not include any allowance for a scrappage scheme.
That's correct, yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Well, the last scrappage scheme was around £61 million to Londoners. This expansion is going to add another 3.5 million more people. We know from the data that the Chair's referred to earlier, lots more people applied for the scheme than received money. So is it reasonable to assume that any scrappage scheme that would go alongside the expansion, should you choose to go ahead, will be considerably higher than £60 million?
So I think there's a couple of discussions which are going on around what the appropriate amount for any scrappage scheme would be. I think what's been clear is the Mayor is absolutely committed to making sure that there is a scrappage scheme to provide support, targeted support, and that the Mayor wants that to be as large as is practicable. But I don't think I can go any further than that at this point in terms of indicating what size of scrappage scheme there could be. Obviously, you'll be aware one of the key things that we've been trying to do is make the case to government that in the same way that they've done for Manchester or Portsmouth or Birmingham, that there should be generous government funding available to help us introduce, you know, a scrappage scheme which would be able to support as many people as possible.
Okay, we'll come on to that in a second. But as part of any scrappage scheme, and clearly you're doing some work on it, came up in the discussion earlier, it's come up many times in discussions I've had with the Mayor. Will this scheme include some form of mobility credits to encourage people to give up a vehicle and to move to using car clubs, bike hire, public transport? Because I think that's a really important message as part of this, as well as cleaning up vehicles where they're needed.
Yeah, totally agree. So with the last scrappage scheme, we did have some third-party deals that were available. So when we recognise that at a point where you're scrapping a vehicle, you then got a kind of decision point. Do you buy another one or do you use that money to do something else? And so we did have some third-party deals with car clubs, with cycle hire, but we recognise that I think we could go a lot further than that. And so that's a really core part of what we're thinking about with this scrappage scheme. So exactly as you say, if you've got that money, it can be worth, if it's a £2,000 payment, it can be worth £2,000 for another car. But could that money go further if you were to use a car club when you needed to use a car club? Could it get you a discounted active travel option? Could we do something with public transport? So we are absolutely looking at that to make sure that there is the most attractive package of other offers, so that when you get that money, you can see that actually, if you're not reliant on that vehicle, there are better ways that you can get more value out of that money by making more sustainable choices. And we're also thinking about how we can kind of familiarise people with those choices if they're things they haven't done before, so that they do feel more kind of viable, that they might do if you're coming to it cold and it feels, you know, more comfortable or familiar to get another vehicle. So we are giving that a lot of thought. And I think, again, that's part of what we want to hear out of consultation. So we're asking people, you know, what do you think you might do? What might you be able to? What might you want to do? And that will also help us kind of formulate that package.
And you could also look at a higher value if it isn't another vehicle that you're getting in to replace your polluting vehicle. Yeah. You could have more money on an Oyster card, to be simple, or, you know, have many years free membership of a car club or whatever. There could be something that
that's exactly what we're looking at.
Lovely. That's really good to hear. Goodness, that's positive. Now, where's the money going to come from for this? Because that's, you know, I realise this is the million-dollar question constantly at the moment, TfL's finances. And as a colleague said earlier, you know, it's not good for your health spending too long on this subject. But, you know, have you had any positive signs from government? Realise, you know, we're going to have change of ministers and goodness knows what soon. But what are you going to do? What's your plan B if the government will not put any money on the table?
So I think probably just to start with plan A, which is definitely the government. And as I said, if you look at other cities across the country, money has been made available through the National Clean Air Fund to support them in introducing their own schemes, and particularly to provide targeted support to the kind of groups which in the past we've funded through our own scrappage scheme. So you know, the Mayor very clearly says that there is a fairness and equity issue in terms of Londoners are contributing to the National Clean Air Fund through the diesel car VED surplus surtax that is in place, and feels that obviously London, which has some of the most ambitious policies in this space in terms of wants to implement an expanded ULEZ, should be able to get the same kind of support as those cities have received. We continue to have discussions with officials about that. I think you've quite rightly set out that there is a changing context in government at the moment, which means that, you know, we have to wait and see what happens. As you would expect, these discussions are closely linked to the separate question of TfL's long-term financial settlement. So while all those pieces are in play, you know, the focus is very much on trying to make the case to government to help us implement this scheme through providing the same kind of scrappage support as they have for other cities. But the Mayor has also been clear that we recognise that a scrappage scheme is going to be important for this kind of scheme, and he would like to put in place as large a scrappage scheme as feasible. So let's wait and see what happens with government, but the Mayor has been clear about the direction of travel for this. And as Christina sets out, we'll also be learning a huge amount from the consultation as well. So there's a little bit of wait and see on some of these questions at the moment.
Given you said earlier that the Mayor will be making a decision at the end of this calendar year on this, and, you know, it's a big policy issue, so you've got to really understand the response and deal with the scrappage alongside it. You then would have, 8 months or so to bring this scheme in. And how on earth are you going to process a large scrappage scheme in that time? And actually, given the previous scheme had over 3 years' notice, and actually if you look at the narrative, and the previous Mayor wanted this policy but it was going to be a year later, people have had a lot more notice. Is the reality that this is too tight a timescale and that you're going to need to delay the date to bring this in a proper way and to allow Londoners, as we heard earlier, to have that bit more time?
So it's a very good question. I think it's important to remember we're not starting from nothing in terms of the work we've done on scrappage. We have obviously already built a system that we've used in the past, and that gives us some understanding and insight about how such a scheme would operate. You are right as well, as you've just heard from Christina, that we also want to learn the lessons from previous iterations of the scheme. So we've been thinking about how we can improve those schemes. So as a result, I think we should be able to move quite quickly once funding were to be confirmed to actually put in place that scrappage support for people.
Okay. So you're not considering delaying bringing something like this in, should you go ahead, to allow more time for people to clean up their vehicles and so on?
I think that's something for the Mayor to consider when he looks at all of the consultation responses. The pace of delivery was a difficult issue for the last one, for the Learn scheme, and it's going to be an interesting issue for this one, really. So I just think he needs to look at that in the round, because on the one hand, you've got this health emergency, 4,000 premature deaths a year, where frankly you have to do something. He's got a moral imperative to do something there. But then you've also got cost of living crisis and availability of vehicles and scrappage, which the things you allude to. So I just think you have to look at all of these issues in the round, really. And I get that it's potentially a difficult decision, but I think we have to, we've had a very strong response to the consultation, over 35,000 responses, lots of stakeholder groups coming in, and I think you have to look at all of that information, put a very considered report in front of the Mayor in October, and then make a decision. And then, for the policy changes, we have to come back to the Assembly as well, of course. So we are cognizant it's a difficult issue, but our job is to make sure that the Mayor has all the key information to make an informed and robust decision.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay, so moving on for our last set of questions for this small section before we move to supplementaries. We should have time for a few of those. Assemblymember Desai.
So, good afternoon, panel. How do you respond to feedback from disability groups, and you heard from Inclusion London earlier this morning, that this expansion would have a disproportionate impact on them, and that the mitigations provided by TfL are difficult to access?
Yeah. It was interesting listening this morning, and as Laura said, we spent a lot of time engaging during the consultation with disability groups. So when we do the work to develop these proposals and do the integrated impact assessments, of course we are trying to consider what all the impacts are and draw up the best proposals and mitigate where we can, and we build them into the scheme. So for example, there were grace periods for the disabled tax class vehicles, which have been spoken about already this morning, which we're proposing to extend. So we have tried to build in some of those mitigations to proposals. But then the real value of this consultation period, because it is a genuine consultation and engagement period, is that we spend our time, Alex and I are both spending lots of time talking to people every week, and hearing the feedback from disability groups directly has been really, really important. So we spent a lot of time doing it, going through why we've arrived at where we've arrived at, them explaining their experience of accessing either scrappage or discounts and exemptions with the previous schemes, explaining situations and circumstances where for one reason or another, even though the scheme is well intentioned, it's missed a group of people. It's really important for us to hear that feedback, and that's what consultation is for. It's for us to now take that on board and go away and see whether we do need to make any further modifications. So I'm very grateful to them for all the time they spent with us, helping us to understand those challenges, particularly now we are in a different outer London context. So the way we respond to them is by taking it on board and then coming back with a response. But we are really listening to what they're telling us and looking at how we can improve and be more supportive where we can.
Thank you. Got anything to add to that? Can I ask you very specifically, would you consider making an exemption from the scheme dependent upon holding a blue badge rather than a disabled registered vehicle?
Yeah, so this is something that we've been talking about at length, and I think the reason that we didn't have a blue badge exemption for ULEZ for central and inner London was that blue badge holders, and this is something in response I've been talking to Laura about, blue badges are linked to a person and not a vehicle, which is why this makes it slightly more difficult with blue badge. So the disabled tax class is linked to the person. With the blue badge vehicle, you can nominate different vehicles. So it's very hard for us to know who's nominating which vehicles and whether they're compliant or not. But when you look at the high levels of compliance in the fleet and the fact that people are nominating vehicles, it should be reasonably easier for people to use a ULEZ compliant vehicle, nominate a ULEZ compliant vehicle. However, I think we have learned through these discussions that the disabled tax class is perhaps not broad enough. The reason that we've been looking at that is to try and understand exactly what the mobility issues are and who's going to find it more difficult and what the reasons for that are. So we are having those conversations now about what the impact is, looking at things like the mobility rates of PIP. So very open to having those conversations. I think the fact that blue badge holders can nominate any vehicle and the compliance level of the fleet is so high means that blue badge isn't the right category or right eligibility, if you like, but we are looking at making sure that we do have the right eligibility and that we are making sure that we're mitigating for all the people that we need to.
Thank you. Chair, are we moving to supplementaries now?
If you have a question on a supplementary to this question, then ask it now.
It was actually from Assemblymember Pigeon's questions, but I can ask them later on, depending on time. I was just.
You're not on my list of supplementaries currently, so you'd like to ask them when we get.
Yeah, just one.
You'll be on the list, all right? Right. So if I go back to the beginning, Assemblymember Prince, I believe you wanted to ask some questions around the principles.
No, I gave that over to Assemblymember Bailey, I think you find.
I'm sorry, I was speaking without my microphone for a little while there.
Yeah. So Assemblymember Bailey, I think, was the person.
And then Assemblymember Bailey is after that on the list. Would you like to, Sean, would you like to ask your supplementaries now, relating back to some earlier questions?
Yeah, yes, I would. I'd just like to pick up on some of the themes that Assemblymember Pigeon spoke about. The Mayor has talked about giving the biggest scrappage scheme possible. Is there any minimum value on that we're speaking about now?
So, as I was saying, I think it's probably difficult for me to put any specific figures on that. I think, just to reiterate, the Mayor wants as big a scrappage scheme as possible. We're talking to government about that. Obviously, you'll be aware that for the previous scheme, or schemes, there was £61 million. Clearly, the Mayor, will continue to make the case for as big a scheme as possible, but there isn't a minimum as such, no.
You've spoken about other cities in the country being given money by the government to have scrappage. Is that correct? Were they given money specifically for scrappage, or they given money for air quality and they chose to spend it on scrappage? The reason I ask this question, because is it right for the Mayor to ask the government to pay for his policies?
So other cities basically were given two sets of funding. They were given implementation funding, which was actually to help them actually implement the clean air zones that they were introducing. They were also then given money for mitigations, which they could then choose to allocate in different ways. Some, for example, provided targeted support to taxes. Others were looking more at businesses. So they could basically respond to the specific circumstances of the clean air zone that they were introducing. But the point was to provide money to help those impacted to be able to prepare for the scheme. And that's the principle that the Mayor is basically saying should be applied for London as well, in the same kind of way, to help Londoners and small businesses, those with disabilities, those on low incomes, to actually prepare for the scheme. should it be confirmed.
And just to talk about the consultation for a second, I've spoken to someone who said to me it was definitely a good idea to launch a consultation with no final costings, no scrappage scheme, and no data from the impact of the previous scheme. Do you think that's a fair criticism of the consultation that you've launched?
Well, there is data on the impacts of the previous scheme. That's in the public domain. We know that the compliance rate for the previous scheme, from the Inner London scheme, is circa 92%. We published a report 1 month on for that, and also we published the latest data on the compliance rate in the update to the TfL board. I think it was 93%. So there is data on the impacts of the scheme, and the reality is we know they work. When the Mayor announced this scheme for Inner London, compliance was circa 39% in February 2017. Roll on to where we are now, and we're at now 93%. A huge shift in shift to compliant vehicles. So that information on impacts of compliance is in the public domain. The impacts on air quality, that's a much more complicated piece of analysis, and that's underway, and we will publish that as soon as that data is available. In terms of compliance, in terms of numbers, and in terms of costs, I've just said on the public record what they are now. We had previously said 200. We now think it's 185. So we are being as transparent as we can be in this process.
But if the focus of this policy is not just compliance, the actual focus is improved air quality, surely we should be waiting for that data before we rush ahead of a change. And even the compliance piece, Central London is a very different beast from Outer London. Earlier, one of our guests said they'd like to see a policy that wasn't one size fit all, because there is a worry with such a large area. Will you actually be incentivizing people to pay? Because because they'll pay and drive around as much as they can to get, quotes, their money's worth.
Well, sorry, the figure I quoted, 93% is for Inner London. We've also published the figure for what is the compliance as it is now in Outer London, which is 82%, and we will kind of track that right up to the kind of go live. So we are being as transparent as we can be. As I said, the research on the actual impacts on nitrogen dioxide and PM 2.5 is a very complicated piece of modelling. That work is underway. We're finalising the report, and we'll get it out as soon as we can, but it's going to be in a matter of weeks. It's certainly this month, definitely.
I don't doubt for a second that you're correct. It's very complicated, but you're asking Londoners to take on a huge financial penalty, which could have negative health effects in the wider aspects of public health. So in order for us to take that, we'd have to understand if there's a win, and that would probably be a big win. And without that data, doesn't it weaken the consultation?
As I said, we published data on the expected impacts: 10% reduction in NOx, 16% reduction in PM 2.5s in the area. So we are publishing it and giving people an informed position on what we think the impacts of this scheme will be from a modelling perspective. We've also got out in the public domain the impacts of compliance, which are very impressive and do indicate that these schemes do work. They do have a big impact on cleaning up London's air. So I think we are being as transparent as we can be. I do get the issue about introducing this scheme in the context of a cost of living crisis. So we are cognizant of that, very much so. But where we've got the data on the impacts of compliance or the impacts on predicted impacts on nitrogen dioxide, they are published and out there in the public domain.
Thank you. Earlier on,
Assembly Member Bailey, I'm really sorry that we've got quite a few other members waiting, and you're going over the same points a bit. Is that okay?
This is an entirely different point. I just want to pick up on something that Assembly Member Pigeon earlier on made several good suggestions of alternatives than expanding Ultra Low Emission Zone. When we were asked about the alternatives that the Mayor looked at, they all seemed to be around just charging. Why weren't other alternatives looked at in as greater detail?
Yeah, so there are a range of other policies. We know that if we're going to tackle the challenges of reducing air pollution tackling the climate crisis and reducing traffic and congestion is going to need to be a holistic, multifaceted approach. This isn't going to be a single kind of silver bullet. But when we look at the scale of change that's needed to meet those targets, it's going to take an intervention like this to get that scale of impact. And so we've looked at the different types and how we can try and find one that has the maximum benefits for Londoners whilst impacting the fewest people in terms of cost.
Okay, there's many who would argue that this policy is not that, but I would just, Chair, back to you.
Thank you so much. Right, Assembly Member Desai has supplementaries too.
Yeah, just going back to the issue of the scrappage scheme, would you agree that if London were to get a long-term funding settlement for TfL, this would actually help the Mayor achieve his ambition, which, to use your words, he wants as large a scrappage scheme as possible, as opposed to the short-term deals we're getting right now and the very real prospect of a managed decline scenario?
So yeah, absolutely, I think is the answer to that. And I think that also goes to some of the points that were made also around, there isn't a silver bullet. We do need to be taking action on all the sources of pollution that there are, including on the transport side, from the bus fleet, from taxes, investing in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. All of that is only possible with a long-term settlement from government. And, Alex may want to say more about this, but without that, it is stopping investment now, which is then delivering improvements or delivering cleaner buses or whatever else, that TfLs can do to improve air quality. But we also know that, to actually deliver against those challenges which Christina just set out, we need to take more action through things like expanding the ULEZ London-wide, but we want to do that in a way which supports those who are impacted, small businesses, those on low incomes, those with disabilities, and to do that we will need government's help.
I'm not going to disagree with the need for a long-term funding deal, so I completely agree. I think the series of short-term deals is not helping us manage transport in the city. It's not helping the boroughs as well. So I think the sooner we shift away from a series of short-term deals to a longer-term settlement, the better, really. I think it's clearly in no one's interest to do this. So we are really pushing as hard as we can to get greater funding support for the rest of the financial year on the revenue side, but also a kind of 3-year capital deal, because it's having deals of weeks, literally weeks sometimes. It's no way to run a city's transport
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Excellent. Next, I've got Assemblymember Baker.
Okay, I've got a couple of quick follow-ups, quick follow-ups that may be requests for information after the meeting, in fact. I just wanted to come back to something Christina said about disabled people and the blue badge is having access to other cars. So you think that there'll be some mitigation in there. I suppose my concern is that the lowest income disabled people are much less likely to be able to access a range of compliant cars. So I'm not sure whether it's realistic to think that's going to be a very effective mitigation. Do you have any data to support that view?
Yeah, so I think that the point about the kind of the fleet of vehicles available to blue badge holders, and I'm going to talk about compliance levels. I don't mean to be glib at all. I understand that if you are a person who can't access this, the impact is great, and that's where we need to try and mitigate. But so we've got 245,000 blue badge holders, and we've got a London fleet which we think by August 2023 will be circa 95% compliant, which means that the vast majority of vehicles will not need to pay the ULEZ. And so a blue badge holder who's nominating up to 2 vehicles, it's highly likely that those vehicles will be compliant because the vast majority of vehicles will be. And it's where you have a vehicle that might be more difficult, or it's adapted, or it's modified in some way that's more difficult or more expensive to replace. That's where we think we really want to make sure that we are providing the right support and mitigations, because if it is more difficult and more expensive to replace your vehicle, that's where we want to be providing the support. But actually, for the majority of people who can nominate a vehicle, and vehicles are 95% compliant, it shouldn't be the case that actually all of those people will need to have an exemption in order to not pay the ULEZ. Most of them won't need to be paying it anyway.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll return to this subject over
Indeed.
the next few months.
No, we're doing lots of work on it.
And specifically, again, around exemptions, I think the blue badge has been used as an example. Have you done any assessment on the impact of the figures you gave up front about the change, the improvements in air quality, traffic and everything like that? Have you got any analysis of what impact that would have if you exempted, for instance, blue badge holders?
So again, I think if you look at the number of blue badge holders, so about 245,000 in London, obviously a much higher number if you start going out to the southeast, the rest of the UK. The way the blue badge discount works for the congestion charge is that people are able to nominate up to 2 vehicles. And again, Laura was talking about this before. The reason that is there, that exemption is in place for the congestion charge, is if you are a blue badge holder and reliant on a vehicle.
Yeah, no, I think I know that. It's a very specific question. Do you know what impact it would have on the projected outcomes if you gave that exemption?
Okay, the short answer is no, because the blue badge, blue badges can be used by any vehicle. So we can't apply, we don't know what vehicles blue badge holders are using. It can change every day.
But you have some idea of what they use at the moment and what they nominate. So is that not something that could be extrapolated? I'm no longer a data person, so.
Yeah, so we don't have that data London-wide. So I know the data that you're talking about is we looked at just the vehicles that are registered for the central London congestion charge. Yeah. I don't think we could probably extrapolate that out, because that's just a daily snapshot of what vehicles have been nominated in that zone. So I think that probably, I don't know if that stakeholder community would be delighted if we took that as their compliance rate either. The difficulty is that the blue badge is not related to a vehicle, and so we can't see what the compliance levels are.
Understand that aspect. And one, and I'm sure this is, apologies, I'm sure this is a request of data. I'm just returning to my questions about journeys earlier on, and not fully yet, or maybe never understanding exactly which journeys and who's losing out. One of the aims is to try and get people to swap to different methods where they're able, public transport, active travel and everything like that. Do you have any sense of how many trips that are not happening in the existing expanded ULEZ have been swapped to something else, or how many have simply not been taken?
It's a very low percentage in terms of mode shift, actually. I think
very
it's less than 1% in terms of that change. The other thing, while you're on that point, can I just correct one of the figures I gave you earlier? I said 70,000 fewer vehicles. It's actually 146,000 fewer car trips a day, actually. So apologies for that. But that is the figure.
What was the 70,000?
146,000.
No, that's fine. I was just wondering what the 70,000 was. No, that's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Very useful. I think Assemblymember Pigeon also has a request along the same lines.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the 6-month report you've said will be out by the end of this month. Will there be an analysis in there about the impact on particular groups like disabled people of the expanded ULEZ? And particularly, will ultimately your final report that you put to the Mayor have a lot more analysis on trying to get our head around some of these numbers around particularly the disabled community in London, so that we've got a clearer idea of the impact of any of these decisions?
There's 2 questions there. The first one is the 6-month-on report. That won't have a detailed analysis by people with disabilities. It's principally about the kind of macro impact on nitrogen dioxide, PMs and overall traffic levels. So it's not going to have the breakdown. In terms of the report to the Mayor, I think there are a few kind of significant issues for this whole consultation, and the people with disabilities is one of those key issues. Then it will be addressed in the report to the Mayor, and we clearly need to reflect the views of the stakeholder responses we've heard, and they've got this view about the blue badge, and we will have some text in to explain what the recommendation is going to be. Whether we can quantify impacts, I think that's unlikely, but we will certainly take that away and look at see if we can rise to that challenge.
Okay, and then finally, Assemblymember Prince, and then we'll need to move on to the bit of the meeting that's our legal requirement to talk about the MTS, but if you want to be as quick as you can, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Obviously, when we had the ULEZ in the central, and possibly, arguably, but I wouldn't necessarily agree, when it was expanded out to the 205, 406, those areas have quite good transport links, although I would argue not so much out in my neck of the woods. But fundamentally, the ULEZ works because people have a reasonable alternative. I would definitely argue, in relation to my other borough of Havering, that whilst we don't have bad transport links, they're not as efficient as using a car, and I can give many of examples where I've had to travel for well over an hour on what would be less than a 20-minute car journey. So a couple of questions based around that. So can you tell me, in relation to PTEL ratings, what are the lowest PTEL ratings for any area in central London? Now, I don't expect you to actually know all these questions. You might want to write to us about this, but roughly the PTEL ratings for central London ULEZ zone, do we know what they are roughly?
Well, the highest is 6, and I would imagine the majority would be in the 4 and above, to be perfectly honest.
6, so a range of 6 to 4. Yep.
1 is the lowest, 6 is the highest, but I would imagine most of central London would be 4 and above, actually. But
okay.
we can look at that. I'm sure there are
and
pockets.
What about the bit between central and the circulars?
It would be lower, but you'll get some. There's some fantastically accessible places in
Assembly Prince, could we possibly ask for this in writing?
Yeah,
because
sure, okay.
It will take a while to go through the different PTEL ratings.
Well, I've only got 3 questions on it, but if you think so. So the point I'm trying to get to is, we know that the Mayor wants to introduce the ULEZ. We know that it kind of works in central. But in outer London, we do not have the transport infrastructure. Is the Mayor proposing to improve with all these extra hundreds of millions of pounds that he's going to be raising? Does he propose to improve the outer London transport offer?
We are improving the outer London transport offer. To give you an example, next week the Gospel Barking line is extended to Barking Riverside. There's a big, heavy bit of transport infrastructure. The Elizabeth line has gone live and is working fantastically well. So we're investing in the rail asset there. We want to do more, as you'll know. In terms of the bus changes, we've talked about the 4%. That's mainly in affecting inner and central London. So we are trying to protect the outer London boroughs as best as we can within that debate, because we recognise that public transport isn't as good as in outer London. Thereby it needs to be protected. I've met with senior officers the Chief Exec in Havering recently to talk about this very issue, about the impact of ULEZ in a borough like Havering, which is where there was clearly a need to improve public transport. We accept that, and we would like to do that, really. So we do understand that issue. The other thing I would ask you to bear in mind, though, is where we are now with the level of compliance, and what we expect it to be by the time the scheme goes live, potentially next August. And we think that around 95% of cars will be compliant by distance travelled with the ULEZ standards. So it's only a charge that 5% of road users within the zone, or London-wide zone, would be paying, actually. So it's actually quite a high compliance level, because if you think, by the time it goes live, potentially next year, petrol cars, you're talking about a car that's, 17 years old, is still compliant. With a diesel car, it's 9 years old, that's still compliant. So I accept that there are issues that some people maybe have older vehicles and will struggle to transition to cleaner vehicles, but that's why the scrappage scheme.
A diesel car that's 9 years old will be compliant? 2014
they became available as Euro 6.
A few, but most manufacturers complied in 2015, I think you'll find.
It's a transition, but they became available on the market in 2014. Yeah, they obviously didn't go all the way live on day one, but it's of that. So it's 8-9 years old. Petrol, I think it started around 2006. The transition to Euro 4. Yeah, 2005-6. Yeah.
05, yeah. Okay, but the ULEZ is going to happen next year. The transport improvements won't be happening next year, will they?
Well, whether it happens next year is a decision for the Mayor to take at the end of the year. What we're doing on the bus network, we will be protecting the bus network in Outer London as much as we can. So we will not be seeing any reduction in services. In some areas, we're looking at improvements. However, it goes back to the point about funding certainty from the government, because if we don't get that long-term funding deal, we do have to shift into kind of managed decline, where you are looking at, rather than the 4% central inner London changes and reduction, you need to go up to circa 18%. So, frankly, every borough in London is going to be affected by that.
But initially, the bus review was to take kilometerage, I think, use out of central and put it into outer. Well, we're losing this kilometerage in central, but we don't seem to be getting any in outer.
There's been some improvements in outer linked to growth areas. Croydon, there's been some improvements. Sutton as well. So there's been some increases, but it's generally it's fairly static in terms of kilometerage in outer London, though.
I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now, as we've reached the supplementary that Assemblymember McCartney wanted to ask, I'm going to allow her to come in now and not later.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo some of the points that Keith has made. I mean, I'm supportive of the ULEZ expansion, but I am concerned that particularly with the impact of COVID, for example, on my local train line, services now 2 trains an hour from Outer London in Enfield. It's not reliable. We often have cancellations. It becomes then an hourly service. We've got, as you said, reductions at the moment in bus services. And although you say central London, I've got 4 bus services which are impacted in Outer London. So it does cause concern. So can I ask, if you do go into a further managed decline scenario and are cutting bus services, will that have an impact on your ULEZ proposals?
I think that's a decision for the Mayor to take, really, about whether we go into managed decline and what does that mean for other parts of his transport agenda. On the frequency of national rail services, you're right, they were reduced quite significantly for some of the lines coming into the centre. They are bringing some of those back in some lines, but not as much as we would like. We would like that to revert to pre-pandemic levels of frequency, so that turn up and go 4 trains per hour as a minimum. But it's taking longer than we would like, really, and I think that's certainly something that we are engaging with Network Rail on and the train operating companies. So how the Mayor responds if we don't get a funding deal, I don't know at the moment. I really don't know. We are working as hard as we can to ensure that we do get a funding deal. We do have funding certainty for the next 3 years on a capital perspective and also a revenue perspective. So I don't think I can't really answer that question about what happens with a plan B or C. We're desperately trying to avoid it coming to fruition.
Right, thank you very much. So I need to, for legal reasons, we need to ask you about changes to the Mayor's transport strategy. And actually, that's a very important and interesting question. So I think that's Christina is the right person to ask these questions to.
It might be a bit of a double act. I'm not letting you off the hook.
So Christina and Elliot as parts of the Mayor's office. So the Mayor's transport strategy is it's an important statutory document. And currently, it doesn't cover this policy. It talks about the expansion to the North and South Circular. It talks about considering future road charging schemes. Arguably, that could be covered by an expansion, but you want to adjust the Mayor's transport strategy to match this policy. So can I ask, was the Mayor's transport strategy not up to date? Can you explain the additions that you're making and why this policy has triggered these changes?
Yeah, sure. So when we're introducing road user charging schemes, we've tended to, and I think this is probably slightly uncharted territory, but the kind of parameters of those schemes tend to be contained within the MTS, and the policy certainly has to be referenced with the MTS. It needs to be in conformity with the MTS. And this isn't in there currently. So I don't think it means that the MTS is out of date. I think it means that we've been proceeding with implementing the policies that were in there. Obviously, the world has moved on. We have new World Health Organization guidelines. We can see that there is an urgent air quality crisis which has gone beyond, which is beyond central and inner London and needs to be tackled in outer London. And so we need to revise the MTS to account for this policy. So essentially, we need to look at the policies that were in there about introducing the central London ULEZ and expanding it to inner London, and just make sure that it now accounts for a further expansion to outer London. And that is, it's a fairly contained revision.
Okay, so what would you say if I said all the things you just listed as being important were equally well known as important in 2018, and including the climate crisis, including the impact on health of air pollution, including the impact of particle matter versus nitrogen dioxide, to be quite honest, should it have not been more ambitious in the first place?
So I think it's important that we don't kind of undermine how ambitious it was in the first place. I think even introducing the ULEZ early in central London, expanding it to an area 18 times the size, these were all ambitious policies. We had a zero carbon target of 2050 in there, which was ambitious, but we were on track to meet. But I think the challenges that we're facing are being brought into ever more focus. So they did exist, and we had ambitious policies in there, and we now see that we need to go further, and we're not shying away from doing that. We are proposing to go further. We're proposing to update the MTS to account for that, and we are proposing these policies. And I think also what we're doing within this consultation is kind of saying, within the MTS, we also flagged that there would be a need for potential further road user charging in London. What we didn't do at that point was specify exactly what that would be. Now, as we kind of come forward with these proposals and we do know what the detail is, we want to go back and make sure that that is included in the MTS. But the MTS was never intended to stop at the end of ULEZ expansion to inner London. There were further policies in there, and now as we have the details of those policies, we need to revise it to include that detail.
So I think that makes quite a lot of sense. You do want to make sure that the MTS includes this. I don't think the changes to the transport strategy are absolutely essential to the ultra low emission zone expansion. However, is that right, that you can't expand it unless you name it in the ultra low emission zone, or does the fact that you already say you want to look at future road charging, and you've already got the reason of air pollution well established within the MTS, which is the ultra low emission zone is an air pollution scheme?
Yeah, so it has to be in conformity with the MTS, which means that it has to be consistent with its policies and proposals.
And I would argue that it is, because it's just a bigger version of the ULEZ you've already got under that policy.
But I think the policy specifies the area that it's in, and so I think we want to make sure that we do this properly. We don't want to be arguing that we can hang it off a policy that's perhaps arguably not appropriate. So I think if we're going to make sure that the scheme is in conformity with the MTS, we want to make sure that it's contained within it.
Fair enough. And I would argue the more significant change that you're making is to name the goals of your road charging schemes, because like I say, at the moment you've got the congestion charge, which is about congestion, not necessarily even about traffic levels, but congestion. And then you've got the air pollution schemes, which have a basis in statutory law that say we have to reduce air pollution. And you're adding to that, you're talking about now in the new draft text in the MTS, the triple challenges of toxic air pollution, the climate emergency, which hasn't been named in conjunction with any scheme so far, and traffic congestion through road user charging schemes, including by expanding the ultra low emission zone London-wide. And so those words are intended, I think, to allow for a a smart scheme of road charging in the future, which has multiple ways of varying the charge. Is that right? And that's what that's also essential for.
So the policy we have in the MTS at the moment actually already accounts for a smart road charging scheme, which we could have multiple objectives. So that it's is not there for that purpose. Okay. I think it's there really to update the context. So as you said, why wasn't this in there before? And I think this is updating with the context that we're kind of identifying now, that we have these three key challenges, which are focusing us on what the next proposals need to be, starting with the expansion of ULEZ, but likely moving on to what do we think the next generation of road user charging should be. As I say, that's already in there. It already says that it would try and achieve multiple things, because you'd be trying to integrate all of those schemes and different objectives. So those three things aren't in there to kind of preempt the next scheme. That's already explicitly covered.
Okay, so those goals are allowed to be attached to a future road charging scheme regardless.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so that would mean, because ultimately, one aspect that, I mean, the other members of the committee might not agree, but I've sort of noticed is a gap, is a safety goal. Because obviously road danger is a genuine thing. Certain vehicles are much more dangerous than others, and you might potentially want the option to vary a charge according to safety goals. Does that mean that it's essential that safety is added to the MTS along with these other parts of the triple challenge, or would you be able to do that anyway?
Yeah, I don't have the proposal in front of me, but I think it's already listed in that policy about the potential next generation of road user charging. I think it already name checks, kind of lists a number of things that a scheme could help to achieve, and I think that includes road danger reduction.
That's it. So that's in the original wording in 2018 rather than the...
yeah. No, you've got goals around road danger reduction, but you've not...
Oh, no, sorry, listed in the... So there's a proposal in the 2018 MTS which is about the next generation of road user charging. Road danger reduction is listed within that.
Okay, great. Okay, well, that's useful to know.
So
Thank you very much. So, do any members have any follow-up questions about the detailed MTS changes? So we're moving now on to road charging, which Caroline Pigeon is going to lead on.
Okay, so this is the road user charging, the future plans for this, which was added into this consultation in some ways, slightly surprisingly, because it's a separate conversation in my view, rather than a strict consultation on a scheme. So how will the responses to questions asked about this shape any decisions to pursue smarter road charging?
So I'll take the first part first about the kind of joining them together in consultation. We talked about this. We talked about what was the best way for us to approach this. And I think what we really wanted to do was kind of present now that we have a really coherent, holistic approach to this and a long-term approach to this. And we want to be able to set that out to people and be able to bring people with us on that journey. So it doesn't feel like we're moving the goalposts. We ask people to respond on one thing and then come out with another. So the questions we have in there, we've set out that we have these triple challenges, that the first step in that is going to be, we're proposing that would be expanding ULEZ, but then actually beyond that we know that we're going to need to go further if we're going to tackle these challenges. So we wanted to be able to have that conversation as a whole and be clear with people about what the longer term roadmap is. And also, I think what's really important is, we've talked for a long time and we've just said, the 2018 MTS had a policy covering this next generation of charging in it. What we don't want to do is look at 2023 and go fully formed proposals and then turn to the longer term future after that and again come out with proposals. And now is the time when we get to say we've got a blank sheet of paper, we want to hear from stakeholders, from the public, start a dialogue about what people would want to see from the future of road user charging. What do we want it to achieve collectively? How can that influence us when we're developing and inform the way that we shape a scheme, and how can we do that with people? And I think that's something that people will often criticise public bodies for coming out with fully formed proposals, and we want to say at this point in time, we're right at the beginning, we'd like to hear from people about what they think it should be so that we can have that dialogue and not just kind of do this and then come back with something separate later, but kind of keep people informed.
Okay, so you're joining these up in a way and you're seeing this as the ULEZ expansion is one step on the road to some sort of comprehensive road user charging scheme. Now, this has been around for some time. It was mentioned in the previous mayor's transport strategy, as well as in the current mayor's. And you've explained why it's, as it were, a blank piece of paper, so I accept that. But why has it taken so long to start having these conversations? Because it's such a big change. And many of us have been talking about this for a very long time. And in fact, this committee recommended in 2017 the mayor should start to look at some sort of smarter system, bringing everything together and looking at VED, being devolved or, as that money goes. So really thinking smartly. Why has it taken so long?
So it hasn't taken so long for us to start thinking about it. We've been thinking about it. We've been doing lots of work on it. We've got a pretty good understanding of it. I think what we're at the beginning of now is the mayor's reaffirmed his commitment to being net zero carbon by 2030. We've got an element energy report that says in order to achieve that, we need a 27% reduction in car kilometres. And that scale of change is going to need some kind of road pricing, that's going to need to be in place by the end of the decade. So what we have now is a renewed impetus and a kind of timeline on it, which we haven't had before.
And so that timeline by the end of the decade.
So it needs to be in place by the end of the decade. I think the Mayor has said that it's something that he'd be looking to do in a next term, if that's what he were doing. And so there is, where the blank sheet of paper, I think, is in terms of kind of developing proposals. It's not us just like turning to a blank sheet of paper and going, so road user charging, what does that mean? We've obviously been working on this, understanding it, talking to people about it, engaging with stakeholders about it for a long time. It's been in those, it's been a public policy for a long time. What we're doing now is actually moving on in earnest to say, how do we start to turn this into some proposals that would work for Londoners?
It's interesting because we have called a number of us for work to be done on this and being told, no, it's not a priority. So you're now telling me it's been going on for years. So
well, I think what we say is that we're working on it, but we're never working on it as the priority because there's a ULEZ expansion or there's, so
okay.
it's...
Okay, I'm sure there's a political direction there, and that's fine. That's the world we're in. What are practically the next steps for implementing a scheme? What would the rough timescale, if you want it in by 2030, say, if you decide to go there, what would be the practical steps?
So this obviously is a very high level kind of couple of questions, non-statutory consultation. So what that will do is give us some information, as I say, that will help us kind of inform what people want to see out of this. So, how do you account for things like road danger reduction? What kind of objectives or elements do people think we should be considering drawing up a scheme? So we've asked about, should we be considering availability of alternatives in setting charge levels, household income? Should it be about time of day, vehicle type, all of those things? So there'll be kind of a period for us to analyse all of that and work through it and kind of understand what that means. And then it's really for us to go away and try and turn that into something more tangible for people, I think. So I think the first thing would be that there would be further rounds of public consultation. So there's kind of the period of development, policy development, if you like. There will be further rounds of public consultation. Public consultation is usually a kind of 6-month beginning to end exercise by the time you've done your proposals and your weeks, and then it closes and we do the writing up. And I think it's very hard to put much more of a timescale on it beyond that because it is new and something that we haven't done before. I think what we can say is that it's probably some years from being implemented. It could be earlier than 2030. We know it needs to be in by 2030. But I think over the next kind of year or two, what you'd really be looking at is that policy development and public consultation phases.
And would you be consulting when you go out to formal consultation? How much in advance would you want to do that? I mean, are we talking a couple of years?
How much in advance of bringing in the scheme?
Yes, like this, because this is very new.
Yeah, so I think it would need to be, it's going to depend on what the proposals are and how they impact, what they are, what the charge level is in different places, what the options are, whether there are still daily charges, whether you're moving to a full distance-based scheme, whether you're not. So I think partly some of that's going to depend on what the nature of the proposals are. I think what we'll want to do is make sure that we're building in like an appropriate period of time. It's just quite hard to say what that would need to be, I think.
I think it's a decent level of time. I think my final question is, and it's something, again, our committee recommended back in 2017. In fact, Assemblymember Copley was particularly keen on this, around making sure the technology that you bring in for any ULEZ expansion, and now you're going to be spending 185 million or more of this camera equipment to make sure that it's future-proof for any future road user charging. But when you look at other road user charging models, they don't necessarily use camera technology. So I'm slightly nervous you're investing potentially in infrastructure which within a few years will be irrelevant because you're moving to other technology. So I wonder if you could respond to that, please.
I mean, I think there's always going to be a need for some camera infrastructure for people who don't want to, can't, foreign registered vehicles. There'll be any number of reasons why you might still need to have backup kind of camera enforcement. So I don't think investment in camera enforcement is wasted money. And I think that's something that we kind of, when we're thinking about what the future technology is, it's also making sure that people feel comfortable with that and that we have the right kind of options in place for people. So I think the camera infrastructure is useful.
Lovely. Well, but we really look forward to seeing how this develops. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
From a committee point of view, you may we will be publishing our work plan relatively soon through the Oversight Committee. We are very keen to look at this issue further as a committee, to follow up on what we did in 2017 later in the year. It doesn't need to be in the report to the Mayor about the Ultra Low Emission Zone expansion, the answers to this question. Are you committed to publishing the results of an analysis of the results of the questions on future road charging at the same time, and maybe ahead of that report? And because that report to the Mayor would be published alongside the decision, and we'd like to see it sooner potentially on this issue.
Yeah, so I think I don't think we can guarantee it sooner because we're running it all as one thing, and there's the other thing is the free text boxes, which take quite a long time to analyse.
But at the same time as the consultation report to the Mayor is ready, you could publish this part because it isn't going to change his decision. But otherwise we won't. If he takes time to decide on the Ultra Low Emission Zone.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question. We can't publish it ahead of that. But yes, we will publish the full results of the consultation. Yeah. Yeah,
and you'll do it at the same time as it's available to the Mayor, rather than the same time the Mayor's final decision on the ULEZ is published.
No, I think we publish it all at the point of decision.
Okay. Please keep us posted on the timetable for that then, because we need to schedule our own meetings and work. Assembly Member Prince, you have a question on this.
Yes, on this one. Is it sensible to pursue road charging at the moment, considering that the government are looking at it and the technology involved is very complicated? Wouldn't it be better for the Mayor to try and work with the government and perhaps even suggest that there's a joint venture with the government on it, rather than trying to jump in early and be saddled with all the expense and all the technology that would be needed that wouldn't really be practical just doing it in one small part of the country?
Yeah, so we are in contact with government about it. We talked to DFT. There's obviously a Treasury-led aspect of this as well, and they are quite different schemes in that regard. So government are looking at this in terms of replacing a tax, whereas our road user charging schemes are there to try and achieve something different. So they're quite kind of fundamentally different schemes that we'd be looking at anyway. And I think in terms of the urgency of the challenges we're looking at, I don't think we can afford to wait.
So are you saying that the road charging would be yet another additional tax on the Londoners?
So the intention of the next generation of road user charging schemes is that it would replace the schemes that we have in place at the moment. So it would integrate, and instead of having a ULEZ and a LEZ and a congestion charge, you'd have a single payment. So it's replacing and integrating the schemes that we have in place now.
Aren't they supposed to not be taxes? Aren't they supposed to be specifically to, in central London, congestion charge reduce the number of cars?
Yeah, so that's my point, that ours wouldn't be a tax.
But isn't the ULEZ supposed to be to improve air quality, and isn't the LEZ supposed to be an issue for commercial vehicles? But wouldn't a single road user charge be a tax rather than achieving those different and separate aims?
No, so we would be looking at developing proposals which would seek to achieve the same behaviour change as the current schemes, and so that is it's complicated, but we'd be trying to set the right charging levels in the right place for the right vehicles that would achieve the same aims. So trying to address air pollution, climate change and traffic reduction.
And are there examples of these working anywhere else in the world?
There are examples of other places that are developing them, probably not in quite the same way that we are. So there are definitely other cities that are looking at this, and we are talking to those cities as well. But so Smart Move in Brussels, for example, is one of them that are looking at doing integrated per mile charges that integrate the objectives that we are talking about as well. So we're not the only people looking at it, but it is something that we are kind of now looking at in earnest and looking to develop those proposals.
Thank you. And thank you, that's fine. Chair, could I also have a written answer to the question you wouldn't let me ask about the recent Imperial College London study that suggests that the ULEZ alone is not an effective strategy to improve air quality?
I think that would be a really good idea, actually. Yes, so we left out part of a question because we covered it, we jumped over it before, and it was specifically to do with an Imperial College study, which we could ask you for a formal response on.
Happy to provide a response.
Excellent, thank you very much. So my final question is about the technology that you're thinking about using for smarter road charging. I mean, obviously, when I hear by 2030, my heart sinks a little bit. That's ages away, and obviously, that's 8 years away. The current mayor has been in post for 6 years now, and it makes me wonder how far we could be along if he'd taken action when the Assembly first asked, when it was first an issue for him in elections. So can I just check, are there any technologies in terms of hardware that were not invented in 2016 that you're considering using in connection with the kinds of schemes you're looking at?
I know Alex is not leaning forward at this point. I might have to come back to you with a written answer on that, because the different technologies and at what point they were introduced is not going to be my forte. But we can certainly come back and talk about, or send you a response on what we're considering and whether that availability has changed.
Because certainly London innovates on these things. It innovates in terms of organisation. We've got all the advantages of an integrated transport authority. If the question isn't hardware but is organisation, then I think we're legitimate in expressing disappointment. If something new has been invented that would be completely necessary to operate the scheme, then we might have a different view. But we can continue this debate later, and we will be, hopefully, as long as we've got the report back in time, be looking at this as a committee as a whole anyway. Right, I need to close the meeting, but that's been incredibly interesting and helpful. The next steps for our committee on these issues will be two things. We will be considering any response to the Ultra Low Emission Zone, and this is if you give me delegated responsibility to work with the team in a minute, and that is optional for the committee. We do have to make a response to the changes to the Mayor's transport strategy, which will then go to the Assembly as a paper for their approval or not of the final strategy change. So that is what will be happening next. But I would first like to thank all of our guests for attending, for their answers. Please feel free to leave while we do all the rest of the formal business. And as mentioned, can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion, and to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any of our outputs arising from this meeting. Thank you very much. Next item is our work programme. So can we note the work programme and meeting dates that are in the papers for the meeting? And the next meeting is scheduled for the 6th of September at 10 o'clock here in the chamber at City Hall. There is no other urgent business. Thank you for your patience, everybody, and the meeting is now closed.